Having predictable policy frameworks for decarbonization is key to scaling up access to green and climate finance, an area where the OECD has much to offer, and which we will discuss in this forum together with development finance institutions later today. Towards this, I am pleased to say that we have established a new pillar on environmental sustainability in our Latin America and the Caribbean regional program. Our project, Enhancing the Green Transition in Latin America and the Caribbean, will promote dialogue and share OECD guidance and best practices. And the next edition of our flagship Latin American Economic Outlook, produced together with key actors in the region, will focus on how to make a green transition work for development. We will also be gathering new data to produce the Latin America and the Caribbean specific edition of our Environment at a Glance. This forum is a testimony of our engagement with the region and our commitment to support green transitions which bring greater well-being to all Latin American and Caribbean citizens. I wish you a very positive and productive meeting today and look forward to the outcomes of your discussions. Thank you very much for having me with you today.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your intervention that highlights the importance of the green transition for the recovery in Latin America and emphasizes the role of the OECD in this agenda. Let us now switch to Spanish. Vamos con español. To listen the intervention of the President of Costa Rica, Rodrigo Chávez Robles. El señor Presidente Rodrigo Chávez Robles, Presidente de Costa Rica, intervendrá vía video.
Quiero enviar un cordial saludo a los presidentes de Estado de la región, al secretario general de la OCDE, Matías Corman, al presidente del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, Mauricio Claver Carone, y al director general de la Alianza Francesa para el Desarrollo, Rémi Rioux. Nos encontramos en una coyuntura global, regional y nacional que demanda repensar nuestras estrategias de desarrollo para avanzar hacia un crecimiento más fuerte, sostenible, resiliente e inclusive para mejorar la calidad de vida de nuestros ciudadanos. Para esto necesitamos una importante responsabilidad fiscal que asegure la sostenibilidad económica del país, mientras que respondemos a los desafíos pendientes en materia social y medioambiental. Necesitamos inversiones de calidad que fomenten la creación de empleos formales en una región donde la informalidad supera al 50% de los trabajadores. Al mismo tiempo, debemos garantizar la calidad de un recurso fundamental, como es el agua, y mejorar la gestión de desechos. La región cuenta con el 31% del agua dulce del mundo y el 50% de los bosques a nivel global. Sin duda, es nuestra responsabilidad cuidar y aprovechar estos recursos, detener la deforestación y a la vez aumentar la cobertura boscosa que llegó a 60% en 2021 aquí en mi país, Costa Rica. Eso es fundamental. Esto se da en un continente donde la deforestación ha aumentado en forma continua y que concentra el 40% de los focos de deforestación del mundo. En ese sentido, creo que debemos promover el crecimiento verde y ratificar el compromiso para alcanzar carbono neutralidad para el año 2050. La guerra ilegal lanzada en contra de Ucrania y su pueblo señala la importancia de ir hacia un modelo de energías renovables que trae el beneficio igualmente de generar empleos formales. Tal como se mencionó en la última edición del informe de perspectivas económicas de la OCDE sobre América Latina, LEO por sus siglas en inglés, producido en conjunto con otros organismos internacionales, Es prioritario repensar el modelo de desarrollo y para eso necesitamos una batería de políticas en materia fiscal, social y productiva, teniendo en cuenta los ejes transversales, digital y ambiental, así como el rol de una cooperación internacional renovada y enfocada en las necesidades de nuestros países. Con la crisis del COVID-19, el endeudamiento público ha aumentado y el espacio fiscal se ha venido reduciendo. La deuda pública con respecto al PIB aumentó en cerca de 10 puntos porcentuales solo por la crisis del COVID, sobre todo si comparamos con respecto al nivel de ingresos tributarios, la deuda pública supera el 400% en la región. Sin duda, la caída de los ingresos tributarios en cerca del 8% en términos nominales durante la pandemia ha exacerbado la necesidad de mejorar nuestras estructuras tributarias. Bajo este escenario, debemos garantizar al mismo tiempo la sostenibilidad fiscal y la sostenibilidad ambiental, lo cual es posible si tomamos acciones coordinadas. Así, la próxima edición del informe de las perspectivas económicas de la OCDE sobre América Latina es particularmente relevante. Plantea los riesgos y oportunidades que tiene la transición verde para la región y pone el foco en la necesidad de tener en cuenta sus condiciones socioeconómicas y sus particularidades a la hora de definir las políticas sociales, productivas y medioambientales. Por eso, la discusión que tendremos hoy en este foro es de primordial importancia para el futuro de la región.
Muchas gracias al señor presidente Rodrigo Chávez Robles por su intervención. We now give the floor to Mauricio Claver Carone, President of the IDB, who will intervene in English. Mr. Carone, the floor is yours.
For having me. Well, now it's working. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon to all of you. Good afternoon to our friends here at the OECD and the French Development Agency. Good morning to all those in the Americas who have connected virtually. I literally just landed from Los Angeles on a plane. So if I fall over on the podium, it's because it was a long flight. But that's how important it was to be here. We hosted yesterday in Los Angeles during the summit, at the beginning of the summit, a trade and nearshoring event whereby we had over 25 ministers of trade and commerce from the region and over 100 multinational companies participate, which shows the interest of the region right now, particularly as we're facing these crises, whether it was through COVID and the shutdown of supply chains in Asia, whether it's now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the interest in Latin America and the Caribbean as a relatively, as I like to say, a sea of peace and tranquility and hopefully prosperity, which is what we're working to help turn it into, is a wonderful opportunity. So it's really great to be here. That's how important it was for me and for us as an institution to be here with you in person today and have an opportunity to discuss these issues as we set to define tomorrow's economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. As I said yesterday to all the companies in LA, you're talking about the right region at the right place at the right time. So this is a timely discussion. Matias and Remy, thank you so much, and OECD, AFD for the partnerships. We really, as a region, appreciate your support. And with AFD, people don't know this, but AFD is one of the best, and Remy's tired of hearing me say this, is one of the best development partners we have in Latin America and the Caribbean. It happens to be true. We do an annual review of our pipeline. We actually have for 2022, 23, like $2.5 billion that we're doing together. It's really an example of the work that we like to do with development finance agencies. So thank you, Remy, for that partnership. So what we're discussing here today really resonates with us deeply at the IDB, as we believe wholeheartedly that green strategies are the best path to a future growth, development, and social progress in Latin America. And what you're going to hear from me today is really the business case, because particularly now when we're hearing, a lot about, obviously with the crises, whether it was a supply chain crisis in Asia, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with all these crises, and then whether it was manufacturing, whether it's now food and energy, the business case for green strategies, green finance, green investment, sustainable growth is more important than ever, because countries are facing hardships in these areas. So the business case needs to be clear, and that's what you're going to hear. Our blueprint that we created from day one of my administration at the IDB for recovery in the region, which we call Vision 2025, outlines the priorities for investing and taking action in response to the greatest development challenges that are facing our 26 borrowing countries. Among its priority areas, Vision 2025 highlights the imperative to boldly address climate change as an integral part of the formula to really create that enabling environment for sustainable and inclusive development. As you know, and all of you know, the pandemic exacerbated many of these social and economic needs in the region, but also compounded by the destructive climate events that have swept across the region, from hurricanes to drought. Latin America and the Caribbean is the region of the world that most suffers from these climate events. 4 out of the 5 countries in the world most impacted by climate events are in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it is the less aggressor, but yet it is the biggest victim of these climate events as a result of all of those emissions throughout the world in that sense. So this underscores the importance for us to work to really abate the impacts of climate change now as it affects Latin America and the Caribbean more than any region in the world, frankly. As all of us agree, due to the lack of necessary structural changes at the global level, greenhouse gas emissions will rebound from the dip that we witnessed in mid-2020. And if global warming is not limited to less than 2 degrees Celsius, Latin America and the Caribbean will suffer damage from climate impacts that could reach, let's think about this, $100 billion per year by 2050. And that's going to impact millions of people's lives. Climate affects economies in the region in different ways, directly and indirectly, on human and physical capital, obviously because of extreme weather, food shortages, because of droughts, and the potential to unleash unprecedented climate-induced migration crises. By the way, of those 4 out of the 5 countries that are most impacted also happen to be 4 out of the 5 countries that most migrants come from, particularly that go to the United States as well. So there is a big climate dimension in that regards to droughts. The negative consequences of climate change often really also take a heaviest toll, as I said, on the poorer households, and therefore have those effects. So the vulnerable become even more vulnerable, frankly, while we're still, frankly, here debating what to do. So today we have to take a real call to action. And as those of you who know me, I don't like to talk as much, although I talk a lot, but we like action. And that's what we're trying to do here at the IDB, because we know that investing in resilience and climate planning not only helps safeguard our future, but actually generates economic growth. Building resilience to climate-induced increases, sea levels, storm intensity, frequency, heat stress, water shortages, agricultural losses, disease outbreaks, and other natural disasters really means mitigating the enormous associated cost. Every dollar invested in resilience, either through better infrastructure or preparedness and systemic risk reduction, can save $4 in post-disaster response and reconstruction costs. That's a good investment. In 2021, talking about action, to help Caribbean and Central American countries, where 4 out of those 5 countries come from, better manage the financial risk of disasters, the IDB created a hurricane clause within our contingent credit facility for natural disaster emergencies. Now it's available to 17 countries, which we began last year, and it allows a borrower to really defer principal debt payments on eligible IDB loans for 2 years in the event of eligible disaster. We're currently discussing this issue as well with Barbados, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. In Barbados, IDB supports efforts to strengthen disaster risk resilience and management through an $80 million policy-based loan in line with the government's Roofs to Reefs program. And as all of you know, Prime Minister Mali has been an extraordinary leader on this front. Also, we're promoting mitigation strategies that can generate better returns on investments than one might frankly expect. For example, the reconstruction of the resilience in the energy sector in the Bahamas project, which we financed with the European Union's Caribbean Investment Facility, will help transform the energy sector in the Bahamas through cutting-edge technologies and innovative solutions. It's going to generate jobs, the economic case. It's going to generate jobs at the same time as it reduces emissions. Who can say no to that? And there's so many more examples like this one, those we're enabling and those that we must enable. And we're seeing that those investments in sustainable infrastructure, such as expanding renewable energy generation capacity and grids, promoting the adoption of electric vehicles, key, improving mass transit, maximizing energy efficiency. Those are win-wins. They're win-wins. They're easy. It should be easy. It should be a no-brainer. Increasing economic growth as well as reducing climate risks. By some estimate, implementing sustainable infrastructure plans could add 1.1 percentage points to global economic growth each year, and around 1.3 percentage points of incremental growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now that's going to require, and this is where these partnerships come in, huge investments, of course. It calls for the creation and adoption of consistent regulatory and financial conditions across sectors, which is where OECD is such a valuable partner, as well as sustaining them over time. And it's going to require decarbonization strategies that translate carbon neutrality goals and socioeconomic aspirations into concrete changes. The path toward decarbonization, here's the economic case, can create 15 million net new jobs in the region by 2030. 15 million net new jobs in the region. In areas such as plant-based food production, renewable energy, construction, manufacturing, that's sellable. Costa Rica's national decarbonization plan is a great example of this. Implementing its national decarbonization plan is going to bring it $41 billion in net benefits by 2050, equivalent to growth of about 0.5 percentage point. Interestingly, a large portion of the benefits would come from the updated land use practices in rural areas. Higher agricultural yields, better livestock productivity, and ecosystem services provided by forests may generate $21 billion in net benefits to the country. In Colombia, in addition to obviously collaborating with the Ministry of Finance and our good friend, Mr. Restrepo, who's here, to a climate change fiscal strategy, we're supporting a sustainable climate resilient economic recovery by providing $600 million in finance for the Program for Sustainable and Resilient Growth, which has then leveraged an additional $600 million in donor funds. In Barbados, as part of the public sector smart energy program, which seeks to reduce the island's dependency on fossil fuels, more than $22 million has been invested since 2020 to move public transport towards electromobility. And part of that comes from IDB, and part of it as well comes from our partners here in the European Union. And it's really because of programs like these that I, for one, am very optimistic about the future of Latin America and the Caribbean. But I would be remiss not to mention the many ways in which the pandemic and obviously the social and economic crisis as a result continues to affect our region. Millions of lives were lost, while millions more lost their jobs and fell into poverty. Many countries exhausted their fiscal resources responding to health, job, and liquidity crises. And we have ministers of finance here who know the difficulties that they have faced trying to figure out the balance and has moving forward in the short, medium, and long term. Today, compared to the past, we have, though, many more tools. And here's the good news. Here's the good news to all of you ministers who are crunching numbers. We have many more tools to mobilize public-private action towards recovery, decarbonization, climate resilience than ever before. So it shouldn't be a trade-off. There don't need to be trade-offs. It's good business. Climate change demands collective action at a global level and a high level of collaboration and coordination among all sorts of stakeholders. Perhaps for the first time, we are seeing a common cause between the private and public sectors. Now, just look at the booming ESG market, for example. And everyone is starting to really understand the effort needed to achieve the impact that's needed. $25 trillion in institutional investors having money looking for ESG investments. We need to mobilize, we need to capitalize on that. Because at the end of the day, here's the reality. We are billion-dollar institutions dealing with $1 trillion problem. So we need to mobilize that private sector capital. As countries seek to reach their commitments under the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Paris Accord, Sustainable Development Goals 14 and 15, the sustainable use of natural capital is obviously going to be vitally important to achieving these natural commitments, the national development strategies, and local livelihoods. And we see immense potential in economic recovery to drive the sustainability revolution. Thankfully, the Latin American Caribbean region is already building the base for sustainability. 60% of our energy is generated from renewable resources. And while renewable investments dropped during the pandemic, they're already recovering. We're seeing Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina are leading the way. Our biodiversity already plays an essential role in softening the impact of climate change through nature-based solutions, which is extraordinarily important. Coral reefs, mangroves that moderate the effects of storms, rising sea levels. Very importantly, our people want to see this green transition come to fruition, and that's important, because there's an investment, there's a human capital investment. Consider, for example, the market research Ipsos did reports 80% of people in Mexico want a green recovery. Now, of course, we have to be careful to manage the fiscal risk of transformation, including the loss of revenue from fossil fuels and disruption in labor markets. At COP26 in Glasgow, we announced our commitment to fully align our loans at the IDB and projects by the Paris Agreement by 2023, a move that's going to help countries fight climate change while also helping the most vulnerable citizens. And we're going to do even more. Last year, we approved a record amount of funding for climate-related projects, $4.5 billion, and we aim to provide $24 billion for climate and green finance over the next 4 years. We know at the IDB that a transition to a cleaner future is possible, and that's going to usher in growth, prosperity for the people that deserve it and want it, frankly. We know that this transition, for it to succeed, we need to work together. And that's why we're working with long-term partners like the OECD, AFD, Germany, Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Spain, Korea, Japan, Canada, many private sector partners to continue developing a robust sustainability agenda with programs and initiatives like, for example, our Natural Capital Lab, which was launched with the French government, which develops innovative ways to mainstream biodiversity development projects, including leveraging private investment, which is going to be key. One major priority, which we're pursuing more than ever, is tapping into the private sector's resources. And I'm going to close down on this. Private sector resources, as I mentioned, are going to be key to help finance the green transition. As I mentioned, these are the funds that our countries need to leverage to be able to achieve their climate goals and green development goals. One of the things I'm most excited about, and I get excited about a lot of things, but this one I'm really, really excited about. IDB and IDB Lab, we pioneered a new tradable natural capital asset class, which we debuted on the New York Stock Exchange. Again, how do you make the business case to do so? How do you market it? What we're doing with the New York Stock Exchange, we're leveraging the power of the market, countries, companies alike, so that they can now be compensated for nature positive management, business case. And that's not only groundbreaking, but it's important. And so we're partnering with, for example, IDB Invest, our private sector arm. We just launched a mechanism to monetize the cost of decarbonization, which is a key feature of a $125 million financing package for Chile's ENGIE and Energía last year. Also last year, we launched the Green Bond Transparency Platform, which is now used by 90% of investors in these ESG investments. And that's clear, because if we have these $25 trillion, how do we ensure, and I was saying this yesterday to these companies, how do we ensure that, let's say 10%, imagine if we get 10%, capture 10% of that $25 trillion for Latin America and the Caribbean. All of US investment in Latin America and the Caribbean is $1 trillion. We're like double that. It's half the GDP of Japan. It will be transformational for the region. So what's our job as an institution? To see how it could be more attractive, how we can make it more transparent, how we can fight against this whole greenwashing phenomenon. Green Bond Transparency Index, we just won an award for it, is pioneering so that investors can follow the path and fight against that. So that digital tool is going to bring greater transparency to the green market in Latin America and the Caribbean, boost investor confidence. And just a year since the launch, as I mentioned, it now covers a full 3/4 of the region's issuances. So we're really proud of that. And finally, our Amazon initiative, which we were created last year at the request of member countries, has nearly generated $1 billion in contributions, which will help us develop initiatives to promote sustainable development in the precious region of the Amazon. It's going to focus on bioeconomy, sustainable management, agriculture, livestock, forests, human capital, sustainable cities, and infrastructure. So we continue to be committed more than ever to working closely with countries represented here today to address climate change, to boost economic growth, to make the business case for it. But there's much more that we need to do, and we can do, particularly if we expand this coalition for a greener future. We hope all of you watching us will join, and I didn't fall over. I don't know how. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mauricio Claver Carone, President of the IDB, for your intervention. We now pass to Spanish. Vamos con español de nuevo for the intervention of Iván Duque Márquez, President of Colombia. El señor presidente Iván Duque Márquez intervendrá vía video.
Quiero saludar a Matías Corman, secretario general de la OCDE, a Rémi Rieu, director general de la Agencia Francesa de Desarrollo, y a Mauricio Claver Carone, presidente del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. La reactivación económica tiene que ser una oportunidad para fomentar inversiones positivas para la naturaleza y el clima. Debemos dinamizar las economías, generar empleos, avanzar en la equidad y la inclusión social, a la vez que conservamos nuestro capital natural y hacemos frente al cambio climático el esfuerzo requerido. En Colombia ya estamos realizando acciones dirigidas a este fin. Por ejemplo, hemos formulado un documento de política pública para la reactivación y el crecimiento sostenible e inclusivo. Este busca desarrollar capacidades en los hogares, el aparato productivo, las instituciones y el entorno digital, para que en el corto plazo el país pueda retomar la senda del desarrollo con inversiones de 35.6 millones de dólares. Además, hemos impulsado las empresas de beneficio e interés colectivo. El país ya cuenta con más de 1.540 de estas sociedades que privilegian el desarrollo sostenible en su modelo de negocios. También contamos con 531 empresas vinculadas en el Programa Nacional de Carbono Neutralidad, que busca dinamizar, fortalecer y visibilizar la gestión de las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero en las organizaciones privadas para aunar esfuerzos en la construcción de una economía baja en carbono. Tenemos una visión ambiciosa y necesaria que hemos ido materializando en nuestro camino a cero. Así hemos sacado adelante leyes como la Ley de Acción Climática y la Estrategia 2050 que lanzamos en Glasgow para tener una Colombia neutra en carbono a mitad del siglo. Estamos protegiendo el 30% de nuestro territorio, consolidando 14 biodiversidades y haciendo realidad la transición energética, la economía circular y la movilidad limpia. También las finanzas sostenibles, fomentando la taxonomía verde para actividades económicas e inversiones con impacto ambiental. Abordar las estrategias verdes para América Latina y el Caribe y la recuperación sostenible que debe seguir tras la pandemia es un aspecto sobre el que Colombia está trabajando y hace un llamado para que todos actuemos ya. Por eso los invito a que sigamos poniendo el desarrollo sostenible en el centro de la agenda, para que nuestros países trabajen unidos y les garanticemos un mañana mejor a nuestros hijos y nietos, a los niños y jóvenes de hoy. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias al président de Colombia, Iván Duque Márquez. Et maintenant, nous allons donner la parole à Monsieur Rémi Rioux, directeur général de l'Agence française de développement, qui fera son intervention en français. Monsieur Rémi Rioux, la parole est à vous.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Yes, since we are in Paris and at OECD, I will allow me to speak in French. Pour bien sûr vous dire tout le bonheur, le plaisir de participer avec vous toutes et tous à ce 14e Forum économique international sur l'Amérique latine et les Caraïbes. Je crois que c'est un des premiers forats, peut-être même le premier, à nouveau ici dans les locaux de l'OCDE. Et donc, c'est bon, c'est heureux, c'est un bonheur de vous retrouver tous ici dans cette salle en personne, bien sûr, en mode hybride, avec tous ceux qui nous suivent à distance, que nous sommes heureux d'accueillir et avec lesquels nous allons échanger des réflexions. Je n'irai pas plus loin que ce que vient de dire Maurizio, évidemment, avec beaucoup d'éloquence, et ce qu'a dit Mathias Corman également sur l'importance de ce forum. Je voulais partager avec vous seulement 2 réflexions pour nourrir les débats qui vont commencer. Une réflexion peut-être de nature stratégique et puis une réflexion beaucoup plus opérationnelle. La réflexion stratégique, c'est d'abord pour féliciter tous ceux qui organisent ce forum, tous ceux qui vont y participer, d'avoir gardé comme thème les stratégies vertes. Bien sûr, le monde est dans un très profond bouleversement, les crises géopolitiques sont de retour, mais il est très important, c'est un élément de la réponse, de garder le fil de la transformation durable de nos économies, de nos sociétés. Et tout le monde doit se souvenir que l'agenda des objectifs de développement durable, l'agenda du développement durable, c'est l'invention de l'Amérique latine et des Caraïbes. C'est à Rio, en 1992, il y a 30 ans, que votre région a accueilli le sommet de la Terre, qui a été la première grande formulation sur laquelle nous vivons encore aujourd'hui, de cette grande politique pour l'environnement et le développement. Je me souviens aussi, il y a peu d'années, en 2015, l'agenda 2030, les objectifs de développement durable, c'est une proposition de l'Amérique latine et des Caraïbes. Je me souviens d'ailleurs, l'Europe a résisté longtemps à cet agenda, un peu effrayé peut-être par son ambition, sa diversité. Et puis, je crois que nous avons tous compris, nous avons tous accepté, et nous nous engageons maintenant pleinement à votre suite dans le Green Deal, dans les stratégies vertes, dans la transition juste, toutes ces formulations qui veillent à réconcilier évidemment la croissance, la prospérité économique, la protection de la planète et l'inclusion et le lien social. Et je crois d'ailleurs que il y a quelque chose de singulier à construire entre l'Amérique latine et les Caraïbes et l'Europe sur ce sujet. Quand vous répartissez l'ensemble des pays du monde dans un graphique en 2 dimensions, non pas seulement la dimension classique de l'indice de développement humain, la santé, l'éducation, la richesse, qui est la façon dont on voit le monde jusqu'en 2015, avec des pays développés et des pays en développement, mais quand vous y ajoutez les émissions de carbone par habitant, vous voyez un monde très différent de celui que nous avons en tête, un monde bien sûr où nous devons tous atterrir dans une zone où nos économies seraient circulaires finalement, cesseraient de dégrader, de manger la planète et où nos populations auraient un niveau de développement suffisant. Et la leçon de ce graphique, c'est que les 2 régions du monde les plus proches de cette cible, de cette zone d'atterrissage, précisément, c'est l'Amérique latine et l'Europe. Et donc, bien sûr, c'est parti d'Amérique latine. L'Europe a suivi avec son Green Deal, dont le Parlement européen est aujourd'hui même en train de débattre. Et je crois qu'il y a, et ce forum peut y aider, je crois quelque chose à construire autour de cet agenda du développement durable, de singulier entre nos 2 régions et sans exclusive, évidemment, de nos capacités respectives de dialoguer, d'entraîner les autres régions du monde vers cette grande transformation. Oui, l'Agence française de développement que je dirige depuis maintenant 6 ans est fière d'avoir investi plus de 10 milliards d'euros en Amérique latine et dans la Caraïbe depuis 2017 pour le secteur public, pour le secteur privé, bien sûr guidé à la demande du président de la République Emmanuel Macron et avec toujours ce souci de l'agenda environnemental. Plus de 2/3 de nos financements ont un impact direct pour l'adaptation et l'atténuation au changement climatique, en prenant en compte aussi la dimension sociale du développement durable. Ma deuxième remarque est plus opérationnelle, pour vous rappeler également que l'Amérique latine et les Caraïbes sont le paradis des banques publiques de développement. On en a eu à l'instant la démonstration avec l'exposé plein d'enthousiasme et de conviction et de force de notre ami Mauricio. La Banque interaméricaine de développement est la plateforme régionale de toute l'Amérique latine et de la Caraïbe, mais toutes les banques qui sont réunies dans l'association ALIDE, tous les membres du club que je dirige qui s'appelle IDFC, les membres de votre région, je pense à la CAF, je pense à Nafin, je serai bientôt au Mexique, je pense à Cabey, je pense à Banco Estado, je pense à Bancoldex, mon ami Javier Diaz que je voyais ce matin, je pense à Cofide, je pense à Bicé, je pense à bien d'autres, à la BNDES évidemment au Brésil. Toutes sont sur la ligne de front de l'investissement durable et de la transformation de nos économies. On en compte 85 dans votre région. On en compte 550 dans le monde, c'est-à-dire 2,5 trillions de dollars chaque année d'investissement. Donc pas des milliards, des trilliards. C'est ça la taille de la somme de toutes les banques publiques. C'est 15% de l'investissement mondial, le total de l'investissement mondial, public et privé, à la disposition, oui, des chefs d'État, des ministres, des gouvernements, pour aller plus loin, pour recevoir un mandat peut-être beaucoup plus fort, beaucoup plus clair, vers les stratégies vertes, vers le développement durable, et bien sûr, Mauricio l'a dit, pour avoir aussi les incitations pour mobiliser la finance privée, bien sûr, et le secteur privé français, le secteur privé européen, très présent en Amérique latine et dans la Caraïbe, le secteur privé, les acteurs du monde entier, le secteur privé local, bien sûr, et avant tout. Donc, c'est cette proposition-là que nous faisons, c'est cette demande d'un mandat plus fort que nous adressons à nos actionnaires, au gouvernement. Nous nous organisons pour y répondre. C'est le mouvement Finance en commun qui a été lancé, Finance in Common, qui a été lancé en 2020, qui tiendra son 3e sommet juste après les assemblées annuelles du Fonds monétaire et de la Banque mondiale au mois d'octobre prochain, les 19 et 20 octobre. Nous serons en Afrique, à Abidjan, juste avant la COP27 à Sharm el-Sheikh en Égypte pour le climat. J'espère qu'en 2023 ou en 2024, le sommet Finance en commun se tiendra en Amérique latine ou dans les Caraïbes pour exprimer encore une fois cette identité, cette force, cette histoire des banques publiques latino-américaines et avancer encore dans la voie et dans l'émergence d'un cadre de référence pour la finance durable. Et je crois qu'ici, bien sûr, je m'adresse à Mathias Cormann, à tous nos collègues de l'OCDE, je crois vraiment que c'est à l'OCDE, avec l'immense diversité des compétences depuis le DAC, l'aide publique au développement, jusqu'au département des systèmes financiers, en passant par la finance climat, en passant par les finances publiques aussi, notamment la fiscalité. Je crois que c'est ici à l'OCDE qu'on a toutes les compétences pour aider à ce que ce grand cadre de référence qui nous manque encore, hein, qui serait cohérent avec l'agenda de Paris et l'agenda du développement durable, finalement refaire la réunion d'Addis Abeba, non pas avant New York et Paris, souvenez-vous de la chronologie de 2015, mais la faire après, 10 ans après. Je crois qu'on a une contribution absolument essentielle à délivrer depuis l'OCDE. Soyez certains que nous voulons l'imaginer ensemble, et notamment fort de l'expérience de l'Amérique latine et des Caraïbes. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Rémi Rioux. Please let me now switch back to Spanish. Le pasamos la palabra ahora al presidente de Ecuador, el señor Guillermo Lasso. Él intervendrá también vía video.
Excelentísimos jefes de Estado y de Gobierno, representantes de organismos internacionales, organizadores del presente foro, jefes de misiones diplomáticas, damas y caballeros. Tengo el honor de dirigirme a ustedes en este encuentro que es de vital importancia para las perspectivas y esfuerzos que juntos queremos encaminar en beneficio de una recuperación sostenible de nuestra región de América Latina y el Caribe y del mundo. En particular, luego de los graves impactos multidimensionales causados por la pandemia del COVID-19. Ecuador fue duramente afectado por los efectos de la pandemia, a más de las miles de vidas que se perdieron de marzo a diciembre del 2020. El Producto Interno Bruto cayó en 6.44% y se destruyeron más de 530.000 empleos. Esta situación ha generado la necesidad de intensificar las acciones para reactivar nuestra producción y hacerla de manera más sostenible, sumando los esfuerzos y compromisos con todos los sectores de la sociedad. Para ello, mi gobierno tomó una decisión fundamental desde los primeros días de gestión, al convertirse en el cuarto país en el mundo y el primero en América Latina y el Caribe que adoptó la visión y política transversal de iniciar una transición ecológica hacia una economía circular, resiliente y bajen emisiones. Uno de los ejemplos concretos de la implementación de dicha transición y de nuestro compromiso con la protección del ambiente y la lucha contra el cambio climático es la creación de la Reserva Marina Hermandad en Galápagos, por lo cual se protegen 60.000 kilómetros cuadrados adicionales de mar, iniciativa que fue anunciada en el marco de la COP26 del cambio climático. Es fundamental señalar que los efectos positivos de esta acción no solo aportan beneficios para la biodiversidad y los recursos de nuestro país, sino también para las poblaciones de diferentes especies que migran de manera natural en el corredor marino del Pacífico Este tropical. Todo lo cual contribuye a la protección planetaria de los ecosistemas marinos. Ecuador mantiene firme su compromiso ambiental y cree en el multilateralismo como un mecanismo idóneo para abordar la triple crisis planetaria. En este ámbito, quisiera resaltar el liderazgo ecuatoriano en la última Asamblea de Naciones Unidas sobre el Medio Ambiente que se llevó a cabo en marzo pasado y en la cual se adoptó la histórica resolución que da paso a la creación de un comité intergubernamental de negociación que tiene el mandato de preparar un proyecto de tratado sobre contaminación por plásticos, incluyendo el medio marino. Como parte de esta iniciativa, Ecuador ha presentado su nominación para presidir este comité y participó activamente en la reunión del grupo de trabajo de composición abierta, evento que se realizó en Dakar la semana anterior. Por otro lado, el año pasado en el Ecuador se suscribió el Pacto Nacional por la Bioeconomía Sostenible, con el fin de promover un compromiso para la generación de estrategias que permitan el desarrollo de actividades productivas enfocadas en la utilización y aprovechamiento sostenible de los recursos naturales. Ecuador continuará en su búsqueda de relaciones cooperativas que permitan enfrentar los grandes retos mundiales, incluyendo la crisis ambiental, y enfatizando en su interés de que el multilateralismo sea el foro natural para la toma de las grandes decisiones mundiales. Muchas gracias. Un saludo cordial a todos ustedes.
Muchas gracias al presidente de Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso. Please let me now switch back to English to introduce you to Marina Sereni, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy and Chair of the 2022 meeting of the OECD Council at ministerial level. Vice Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, I am extremely pleased to intervene in the 14th International Economic Forum on Latin America and the Caribbean. Italy and the countries of the region have developed a special relationship based on the values of peace, democracy, rule of law, security, human rights, and fair and sustainable development. We share deep cultural, political, economic, and social links. This special relationship represents nowadays a growing partnership based on a genuine spirit of mutual solidarity towards common challenges. The devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic have been one of the main current challenges which have exacerbated the already existing fragilities of our society in Latin America, in Europe, and all over the world. For this reason, we cannot forget the importance of accelerating the achievement of the UN 2030 Agenda's Sustainable Development Goals. In this spirit, we shaped the program of the Italian G20 presidency last year. People, Planet, Prosperity represented the three thematic areas we decided to focus on. In this regard, we devoted the particular attention to the promotion of inclusive and people-centered policies, environmental protection, clean energy transition, and sustainable economic growth. The same priorities have been chosen for the 10th Italy, Latin America and Ministerial Conference, which we hosted last October. On the occasion of the 2022 OECD Ministerial Council meeting chaired by Italy, we would also like to draw attention of the membership to the necessity of ensuring a more sustainable future for the next generations. We should reaffirm our commitment in fighting climate change and the erosion of biodiversity. To this end, it will be key to pursue the transition to affordable, modern, reliable, and sustainable energy production through joint actions aimed at further promoting the use of renewable energies and the adoption of clean technologies. Let me emphasize Italy's effort in promoting a more equitable, sustainable, and resilient post-pandemic recovery, which includes a primary role for the renewable energy sources, as well as the use of innovative technologies. For the first time during the Italian presidency, the G20 Italian presidency, an action plan for smart, resilient, and sustainable cities was approved, leveraging on energy efficiency of buildings, zero-emission mobility, digital power grids, and nature-based solutions. This is actually one field of our development cooperation with Latin American and Caribbean countries. Especially in light of the Russian aggression to Ukraine, we must remember that in the medium term, the ecological transition will bring security and autonomy for our systems, as well as increased economic growth and employment. Accelerating this process is therefore the lasting and sustainable solution to the problems inherent to the fossil fuel system. In order to have a profound impact by 2050, we need to accelerate the policies for the deployment of already available technologies and to further stimulate research and development of new solutions for clean energy. Latin America and the Caribbean have great potential for clean energy and very valuable experiences to share. The perspectives for a green transition appear to be comparatively more favorable than in other regions of the world. It is therefore crucial to identify the right forms of collaboration to fully develop this potential and share good practices. In this regard, in addition to public intervention, the role of the private sector is key in order to accelerate the green transition. Italy operates in Latin America with some renowned companies in the energy sector, which are investing in renewables, electricity grids, sustainable mobility, and green hydrogen. In this context, and in the face of the current international crisis, which will bring profound new global challenges, I wish to recall that in our effort to build back better, greener, and juster, we must continue to act with a coordinated international response to emergencies. And this obviously also applies to climate change. Only international cooperation and effective multilateralism, inspired by the guiding principles of the United Nations, can in fact guide us in facing these common challenges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marina Sereni, for your intervention. We are grateful for the interventions made at this opening session of the 14th International Economic Forum on Latin America and the Caribbean. We have discussed some key elements to take into consideration for Latin America and the Caribbean to take advantage to achieve the green transition in a sustainable and inclusive manner. As the OECD Secretary General Matthias Cormann commented, these issues will be addressed in the forthcoming Latin America Economic Outlook 2022 or LEO 2022 report, co-produced by the OECD Development Center, the UN LAC, the European Commission, and the Development Bank of Latin America. We now give the floor to Raga Arnadotir, Director of the OECD Development Center. Ms. Arnadotir will be moderating the session on green and just transition in LAC. Who do we need at the table? This session will emphasize the importance of close collaboration between the public and private sectors, including firms, including, of course, the academia and civil society organizations. We invite all the speakers to join the podium and attendees to remain in your seat to start now with the next session. Ms. Arnadotir, good afternoon. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carol, for this introduction, and welcome everyone to this Latin American Economic Forum, which we at the Development Center and at the OECD are extremely happy to be hosting here in-house with all of you in the room. It's been a long time since I've been in a room that has so many people present, so I'm very happy. And I would like to also thank very much our good partners who have spoken here today, the IDB and the Agence Française de Développement. I'm still working on my French. This is the 14th time that we are hosting this, organizing this together. And yes, please, while I make this introduction, I would be pleased to have the panelists up here. This is the 14th time, as I said, that we're organizing this conference in good cooperation with our partners. And it has been a wonderful, wonderful partnership. I was very inspired by the high-level speakers here in the session before about their strong commitment to driving the green transition in Latin America and the Caribbean in the opening session. And we know, just to set the scene for the conversation that we will be having, we know that the green transition may not be an easy one. There might be winners, there may be losers on the way. At least temporarily, in the end, we will all be winners. But this process may create resistance to change from those who stand to lose or from those who see an advantage in preserving the status quo. And we know that the green transition will only succeed if it's fair and if it's legitimate. So to achieve this, we need all hands on deck, and we need all the relevant voices involved in the design of green policies. And this means actively and effectively involving all the relevant actors and perspectives, the private sector, civil society, local authorities, and the many sectors that have all the expertise that we need to deliver this home. The constitutional process in Chile, and we have the Honorable Minister of Finance from Chile, Mario Marcel, here with us today. That process stands out as an example of an ambitious and recent example of broad involvement and participation. Through this process, environmental dimensions like the rights of nature and water protection have been included in the new draft constitution. So this is what we are doing here today. We are gathering together different perspectives from different sectors to facilitate the green transition. And turning now to the distinguished panelists that we are so privileged to have, and that I know will help us address what I believe are the fundamental and very relevant and practical questions. How do we create consensus among stakeholders to advance the green transition? What policy areas are critical to building effective green strategies in the region? And how do we make sure that these different policy objectives are compatible. So let's dive in. And let me now turn to our impressive panel. And in order of time, I will just introduce them one at a time when I give them the floor. And let me first turn to the gentleman I mentioned before, Mario Marcel, the Minister of Finance of Chile, to introduce him. From 2016 to the end of January 2022, he was the president of the Central Bank of Chile, and previously he was the director of the World Bank's Good Governance practice area. He has been the deputy director of governance and territorial development at the OECD. So he feels right at home, I assume. And he's been the manager of institutional capacity and finance at the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. So, Minister, in the context where Latin American citizens are asking for better economic, social, and environmental outcomes, and as well in the context in which an environmentally sustainable recovery is more important now than ever, what can governments do to make these different policy objectives compatible? And how is your government, how is Chile approaching this issue? Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks again for this opportunity to be back at the OECD. It's great to be here again. Now in this capacity as Minister of Finance I'm about to complete 3 months, so it's not long, but many things have happened in the meantime. And I wanted to address from that perspective some of the questions that were posed. So first of all, I think that when we ask who do we need at the table in the case of green and just transition in Latin America, I think that this is a question that is much broader than related to a green transition. In our view, and it's part of our way of working these days, we acknowledge that that private sector, civil society, and the government need to be brought together for a number of key policy decisions. Only last Saturday, I closed a cycle of public consultations around a tax reform that is a main part of the government agenda, that quite surprisingly was the first one that happened prior to a tax reform. In all our prior experiences, tax reforms were thought of something that you developed with a small group of specialists that you would have to keep as secret as possible and then bring to Congress and get that approved as fast as possible as well. So in this case, we discovered that there was a great interest in sharing views about the tax system, not only among business people, but also by common citizens, community organizations, and so on. And that was, I think that was a mutual learning exercise that was extremely rich, I believe, and I think an extremely positive experience. So that is an approach that we should increasingly apply to many areas of reform. Now, dealing with green transition, I think there is a second issue that has to do with the way we see green transition as part of economic development. For many years, we used to think about environment protection and investment and growth as opposing forces, as environment protection as something that would limit or create some kind of bottlenecks or questions on economic growth. Our view is that that has been changing a lot. And today, given the worldwide concern about green production, sustainability, and so on, and the value that people put on goods and services that are produced in a way that respects the environment, means that those that are faster in terms of introducing or developing the green economy will have comparative advantages in the world stage. In our case, for instance, well, I'm just coming from another forum where I explained the progress that, for instance, some mining companies in Chile, many of them foreign, are introducing new ways of producing with a lower effect on the environment, particularly in the use of water and energy. And I think that we are in the middle of a very interesting transition in the mining industry in that sense. But of course, there are a number of other things where, and then I move to the third issue, where government can help to produce this connection through things that only governments can do, including the traceability of products, certification, measurement of carbon emissions, and so on. In our case, we have moved even beyond that to generate a green taxonomy for green bonds and environment-related bonds to be issued by the private and the public sector, and to make sure that on the basis of that taxonomy, we can characterize projects and investments and actors that prevent greenwashing, that I think it's a great risk these days for many countries. Then I think that, and then addressing your question about, or your reference to the constitutional process in Chile. It is true that the environment has been very central in the constitutional discussion. I think it's also fair to say that the process has not been straightforward, basically because environmentalists concentrated in one commission of the constitutional body, and they tended to produce norms that were too much self-centered, that were not sufficiently shared by the rest of the constitutional body. So they needed a number of iterations before getting into the final drafting of the Constitution. Now, with the text that is almost finished and will be completely finished in a couple of weeks before being put to a referendum, I think that this will be the first, as far as I understand, it will be the first constitution to speak of rights of nature. Now, that will involve a major challenge for policymakers, for experts on constitution and law, because the difficulty is who is the bearer of those rights, in contrast with other rights that are usually included in constitutions. But I think that what I can report at this point, and given that you were asking about critical areas, I think that the area of water is particularly complex, because at least in our case, and I think it's the case of in a number of other countries, Chile has been enduring a drought that has lasted already 12 years. So conflicts around the use of water and water rights have intensified quite significantly, and therefore putting together a constitutional framework and then later the legal framework for that will be very challenging, because that is perhaps in contrast with what I mentioned earlier about about green production. I think this is an area where the risks of zero-sum games is much more relevant.
Thank you very much, Minister. This is very interesting, and that's obvious from your intervention that there is indeed a lot that the government or governments can do in this respect. And it was interesting to hear about the discussion in Chile. We know that dialogue can be cumbersome. It can take time, but in the end, usually it saves time in the long run. So let's hope that is going to be the case. But now turning to Adalberto Maluf, hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. He's the president of the Brazilian Association of Electric Vehicles and director of marketing, sustainability and new business at BYD, which is Build Your Dreams in Brazil. He has vast experience in renewable energy. So now we're moving more into the private sector side and association side. He has experience in the automotive industries and climate change mitigation. He also has experience in urban development, corporate social responsibility, and working with nonprofit organizations. And Alberto, turning to your current expertise, we see that everywhere worldwide, the sales of electric vehicles are booming, they're growing. And although the Latin America and the Caribbean are still in the early days of this evolution or adoption, the number of privately owned electric vehicles across the region are gradually growing. And meanwhile, the regional transport sector is the largest source of energy-related emissions. So in your capacity as the president of the Brazilian Association of Electric Vehicles, what policy frameworks do you see that could promote and make it faster, the low carbon transport sector, while at the same time creating quality jobs? And you have 5 minutes to answer this little question.
No problem. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of the private sector view on this. As you mentioned, Latin America is a place where public transportation plays a key role for economic, social, environment. Most of our countries still rely on public transportation. We have been losing passengers for many, many years, which brings deficits and lack of funding as one of the greatest priorities for governments in Brazil. At the same time, greenhouse gas emission comes from transportation. We need to reduce. We need to have new ways of funding and finding solutions. So we have good examples. We have here Chile, Colombia, for example, two countries that have led the way in creating new economic models, separating the asset, the bus from the operation, bringing big investors, a lot of European utilities to buy electric buses, create infrastructure, renewable energy, and renting the buses to the cities. So we have almost 3,000 buses running already in Latin America. Chile was the first one. Now Colombia having a good fight with Chile to see who has the biggest fleets. It's really good. And renewable energy is one of the leading sources of Latin America. We already have a clean energy matrix. Solar distributed generation, for example, was the #1 source of Brazil last year. We got back to the top 10 in solar. We have a lot of wind during the night. So we can power our buses almost for free, very cheap. We can generate green hydrogen in the northeast of Brazil, for example, have huge projects to export to Germany. And we have seen, especially in the face of the trade agreement between Mercosur and European Union, that a lot of countries in Latin America, they are trying to put targets. You know, they approve targets 2035 or 2050, and it's Chile, Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay. Unfortunately, Brazil is a little bit behind. We don't have a national policy for electric mobility. We don't have industrial policies. Even our environmental policies have been reduced dramatically in the last years. To have an idea, an electric car in Brazil pays more tax than a combustion engine car. An electric bicycle pays more tax than a normal bicycle, than a gun. It doesn't make sense. And especially after pandemic, where micromobility has been growing, the sales of electrical bikes and scooters is booming. Also in Brazil, we sold 35,000 hybrid and electric cars last year, which is good. It's a 77% increase. Trucks, last year we had more than 1,000% increase in Brazil. This year already sold more trucks than last year in the first 4 months. So green logistics, pushed by the private sector, e-commerce, beverage companies, it's moving, ESG agenda. We have a lot of things happening, but in my opinion, as we lack this national coordination between all the stakeholders, universities, private sector, local governments, we have a lot of initiatives, but they are a little bit disorganized. And we have not been able to fulfill the promises yet that we have. See the case of Brazil. Brazil used to be the 6th largest producer of cars in the world. We are still the 4th largest producer of bus and trucks. And out of all these 3,000 electric buses sold in Chile and Colombia, all of them come from China and not from Brazil, which historically sold the vehicles there. When I was born in 1982, industry of transformation represents 35% of Brazilian GDP. Now it's 9%. With no industry, there's no good jobs. Then we come back relying, as most of Latin America, in exporting commodities. And there's a lot of consequences on that regarding the ability for us to deliver the green industry we all want. But the good news is that there are a lot of things moving, a lot of stakeholders ready. We did a lot of pilot projects, a lot of planning, a lot of studies. IDB has made a big work for many years. The World Bank, the French Cooperation Agency, everybody's there, everybody's trying. So maybe very soon, we're gonna put together all the political guys to set up the priorities, set up the targets, and really try to move. Of course, for Brazil, we are thinking about the jobs, we're thinking about the greenhouse emission, which comes from the city. But of course, the city also have an indirect impact on deforestation, for example. And the case of Brazil in the last 3 years, deforestation increased a lot. We are seeing now illegal mining under the Indian tribes. You know, like a British journalist was just missing 3 days ago there with a very famous Indians guy when they went there to record what's going on. So environmental policies as a whole in Brazil still need to be improved, the framework. But the good news is that the private sector is there trying to do what they can. And I'm pretty positive that it will continue to grow and expand as time comes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You made the strong case for good policy making. Your example on the taxation was striking. And also for the need for national coordination. What I found most interesting, though, personally most interesting, being from Iceland, that you said that the wind is only blowing at night. I think that is remarkable. I wish that would be an export commodity. I know a country that would be able to buy. But to get back to the topic, I would like to turn to and introduce Veronique Andrieu on the far end. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature here in France. And we continue to bring different perspectives to the table. Veronique is an international development specialist. Before becoming the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund in France in 2019, she served as an Oxfam regional director for South America and the Caribbean, as well as for West Africa. So wide-ranging geographical and sectoral expertise. So I would like to ask you about exactly that, regional and international cooperation, which must play a key role in transitioning towards a sustainable development model. In your view, Ms. Andrew, how can international partnerships, for example, between LAC and the European Union and France in particular, help to promote green strategies in the region in areas like biodiversity and green innovation, for instance? And how can these partnerships help ensure that the transition will be just? Again, small question for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, so thank you for having me. Y buenas tardes a todos, un placer. The case was made about, climate change. Maybe I would add also, the science is there, the IPCC reports, the IPBES reports on biodiversity loss. This is a very important decade when it comes for climate change, of course, but also biodiversity. I was glad to hear about deforestation, water issues. Indeed, these are of paramount importance. We always have in mind the importance of reducing emissions down to net zero, so by 2050, and halving emissions by 2030. This I think is very clear for all actors, governments, cities, companies, of course. But it's less known that biodiversity nature is also of a high risk for all economic activities. So today, my goal is to make the case for nature and for, physics, chemical materials. The world is made out of these natural fluxes of material. And so it's very important that we have those in mind. Sometimes, at WWF, we work with companies. Our theory of change is that companies are a lever for change, very powerful. We hope to get a knock-on effect and to have some champions that will transform their operations, their core business, and that will help the sector to advance and to make progress. So what do we hear from them? Well, first of all, it's about how do we do what you ask? How do we achieve those goals? Please help us to bridge the how gap, because we don't know how to do. And so we bring solutions, we bring tools, we bring metrics on the table, and would like to give 3 examples. For instance, when it comes to climate neutrality, mitigation, adaptation, one key tool is the Science-Based Target Initiative. Just prior to the COP26, there is a net zero SBTI standard that has been released. This means to reduce down to 95% of the emissions, to cut them. And so this is a very ambitious goal. So that's where all companies should be going. There is good news in LAC. Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Mexico have companies that have already submitted targets for validation to SBTI. So this is very good news. It's 100 Latin American companies. It could be more. So it's a plea to have more, enhanced progress on the SBTI. So that's one example. It works, it's sectoral objectives, so it works for all sectors. Another example is about deforestation. Regulation matters very much. And Rémi Rioux from the AFD was mentioning the important role that the EU and also Latin American and Caribbean play, as you know, in the forefront of environmental agenda. And indeed, what we're asking for now, there is a legislation going through the Parliament and Council in Brussels on the transparency, traceability, and due diligence of supply chains. How companies know who their suppliers are, how they work, what are their standards when they source materials. And it's very important that we ensure that, for instance, biomes so important like Cerrado, Pantanal, we always hear about the Amazon, but savannas and grasslands are also very important for the water cycle. So that to ensure that there is no deforestation and no conversion of those critical ecosystems. And to achieve that, there is the Accountability Framework Initiative that helps you to go through your supply chain and to ensure that you root out all deforestation from it. And my last point is about natural capital tools. That works for forests, water, and in general, biodiversity. There is an instrument prior to the COP15 of the Biodiversity Convention that will take place in China, hopefully later this year, to achieve a nature positive world. This is very important. It's the equivalent to the net zero climate agenda, but on the nature front. So that we achieve that by 2030, we have more nature than the cutoff date of 2020. So to achieve that, there is the Science-Based Target Network, which is, it mirrors the SBTI initiative, but for nature. And the good news is, for instance, here in France, we have launched a Natural Capital Lab to, let's say, test and learn on this tool, on the Science-Based Target Network standards for forests and for water. So this would be some examples. But in general terms, we see that the conversation is evolving, and that many companies are making progress also in LAC. And it's very important but there is still woefully a lot more to do, and we need to accelerate, to step up. And so it's very important that this becomes a systemic change, and that it is embedded in how the targets and the objectives of the companies are made. And also, for instance, in terms of the remuneration of the boards and the SMTs internally at the corporate level, so that what we give value to and is paid for is also success and achievements to the targets set by the company, both in terms of climate and nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Veronica. This has been very interesting, and obviously international cooperation and standard setting and benchmarks are key to advancement. But you also mentioned bridging the how gap, a term that I like and is a good segue into our next speaker, who comes from the academia, Alejandro James, I'm sorry. I should know this because I had the pleasure of visiting
we were together in Bogota.
We were together in Bogota. He's the rector of Colombia's Universidad del Rosario. And he has a PhD in pedagogy from the Universidad UPA-EP in Mexico. And he's also the professor of business and administration at his University del Rosario. Now, bridging the how gap, what is the role of the academia? The green transition will change everything. It will change jobs, and it will change the skills that we need for the future. So the responsibility and the task of the academic institutions is huge. And could you share your views on how the academic sector could foster this change and facilitate the just transition in the region? And what, in your opinion, would be the most important skills for students and workers to have to successfully navigate this important transition?
Thanks, Raga. It's a pleasure to see you again. Voy a compartir con ustedes algunas reflexiones o 3 reflexiones sobre lo que considero deben ser cómo podemos cerrar esa brecha de las competencias que deben tener muy especialmente los jóvenes en países de América Latina, como puede ser en ciudades tan interesantes como es el caso de Bogotá. Primero, nosotros en la Universidad Raga, nosotros realizamos una encuesta en más de 10 ciudades cada 6 meses. Y en esa encuesta, lo que hacemos es que le preguntamos a los jóvenes en Colombia lo que piensan, lo que sienten y lo que quieren. Para que te hagas una idea, nosotros realizamos una encuesta a los jóvenes que representan un universo de más de 4.3 millones de jóvenes. Insisto, sobre temas tan interesantes como lo son el cambio climático. Y te voy a compartir algunas cifras que me parecen aterradoras. Le preguntamos a los jóvenes cuáles son las emociones que se generan cuando se habla del cambio climático. Y ellos contestaron que la emoción que más les experimentan es el miedo y la tristeza. Pero cuando les preguntamos cómo ven ellos, insisto, más de un universo de más de 4 millones de jóvenes en Colombia, le preguntamos cómo ven el futuro. Y la afirmación de ellos es que, tal cual lo leo, dice, el futuro es aterrador en un 38%. Después le preguntamos sobre la siguiente generación. Ellos afirman, las siguientes generaciones tendrán menos oportunidades en un 28%. Pero algo interesante, le preguntamos finalmente en todo este tema de cambio climático, ¿a qué debe o cuál es la razón por la cual se está presentando este ejercicio? Y ellos lo que contestan es, el 75% de los jóvenes manifiesta que el cambio climático sin duda se debe a razones de la actividad humana. Pero también le preguntamos a los jóvenes en quién confían como unos actores importantes para detener el cambio climático. Y mira lo que contestan. Líderes ambientales, en un 49%. Los jóvenes confían en los líderes ambientales. En los científicos, el 48%. En los campesinos, el 46%. Y una cifra similar en los profesores en 44%. Me llama la atención cuando le preguntamos la capacidad que tiene el gobierno para intervenir y detener el cambio climático. Dice el gobierno solamente el 16%. Pero hay dos cifras ya para entrar al tema que digamos, el principal, que son las competencias. Le preguntamos, insisto, a todos los jóvenes en Colombia, si conocen o no los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Jóvenes que están entre los 18 y 32 años. Y la respuesta es, solo el 13% conoce los ODS. Y cuando le preguntamos si conocen realmente la Agenda 2030, y contestaron que solamente el 7% conoce la Agenda 2030. Luego es bastante interesante porque cuando uno está en un ejercicio pedagógico de transmitir o de incorporar la dimensión ambiental en el corazón de cada uno de los jóvenes, lo más complejo es, insisto, es que no tienen el conocimiento necesariamente sobre estos desafíos. Luego, sin duda, lo vamos a ver más adelante cuando veamos cómo se va a financiar toda esta transición. Existen sin duda un gran desafío económico, un gran desafío financiero, tecnológico, entre muchos otros, y político, por supuesto. Pero en mi opinión, en este momento, el principal desafío, sin duda, es un desafío pedagógico. Y mira esto, cómo desarrollar la competencia para, insisto, para incorporar esta dimensión ambiental en cada uno de los jóvenes en los países de América Latina. Sin duda, a través de procesos de enseñanza, a través de procesos de investigación y de extensión. Pero tal vez lo más importante, recordar que las competencias tienen 5 dimensiones. Los conocimientos, que tú de alguna manera lo explicabas muy bien, los conocimientos son muy importantes y por eso debemos trabajar en programas de pregrado, posgrado, entre muchos otros. Pero no se nos puede olvidar, Rag, que tal vez para desarrollar competencias en los jóvenes lo más importante son las experiencias previas. Sin duda, todos los que estamos en este auditorio compartimos la necesidad de desarrollar las actitudes y aptitudes como un tercer y cuarto elemento de las competencias. Pero tal vez lo más importante, ministro, que es tan interesante, y es cómo desarrollar, cómo cultivar en los jóvenes los valores que se necesitan, que acordes, insisto, con todo el desafío ambiental que estamos viendo. Para eso tenemos, digamos que 2 conceptos importantes. El primero, el de innovación pedagógica. ¿Qué significa esto? Hemos logrado sin duda grandes resultados en las últimas décadas con los temas ambientales, pero como bien lo decía, el 13% de los jóvenes solamente conoce los ODS. Luego, realmente lo que significa es que necesitamos hacer una innovación pedagógica para llegar al corazón de los jóvenes. Fíjate lo interesante, en nuestro caso, hacemos toda clase de estrategias, te menciono un par de ellas. Tenemos un bosque, además un bosque espectacular que ojalá nos puedan conocer algún día, un bosque de los magnolios. Pues bien, estamos construyendo otros 2 bosques, pero esos bosques los construimos con los jóvenes para que realmente puedan incorporar esa dimensión ambiental. Tenemos una estación experimental a 2 horas de Bogotá y en esa estación experimental sin duda hacemos toda clase de ejercicios pedagógicos sobre el medio ambiente y sin duda sobre los efectos del cambio climático. Pero también todo el manejo de residuos, todo el manejo de energía, de agua, en fin, entre muchas otras. Luego yo lo que te diría es que hay 2 elementos fundamentales para el desarrollo de competencias. El primero, el de la coformación. ¿Qué significa esto? Que todos participamos en la conformación de competencias, insisto, para incorporar el medio ambiente en los jóvenes. los empresarios, como tú le decías, sin duda el gobierno, sin duda todas las organizaciones, profesores, entre muchas otras. Pero insisto, es un ejercicio de coformación. Y finalmente, es un ejercicio también en el cual lo que se requiere es una innovación pedagógica. Y debemos entender que los jóvenes, ya para terminar, que veo que se me acabó el tiempo, los jóvenes aprenden 365 días del año, Raina. Los jóvenes aprenden en todo lugar, en la universidad, muy especialmente en sus casas, en el transporte público, en todas partes. Pero tal vez lo más importante, los jóvenes aprenden de todas las personas. Y es la razón por la cual nuestro testimonio y los que hemos escuchado el día de hoy son fundamentales para esa innovación pedagógica que tanto se requiere. Muchas gracias, Reina.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's true. We are all responsible. Very good. You named very many of my favorite words: innovation, education. I think that is the one key link to this, the solving this problem. And as you said, together. Finally, the missing link in our composition of the panel is the private sector. I'm now turning, it's my pleasure to turn to Trinidad Jimenez. She's the Director of Public Affairs Global Strategy at Telefónica. And before joining Telefónica, Ms. Trinidad had an impressive career as a civil servant, as a minister, Spain's Foreign Affairs Minister in 2010, as Health and Social Affairs Minister in 2009, and as the country's Secretary of State for Latin America. So we're tying this up by bringing the public sector and currently the private sector to wrap it up. We heard education, we heard innovation, and coming from Telefónica, we see the digital transformation as a key lever for recovery and a driver of greater productivity and inclusion in the region. Telephones bring us together. Something that we highlighted in both of our 2020 and 2021 editions of the Latin American Economic Outlook that was discussed here before, and where Telefónica, I have to plug that here as well, is an excellent partner. So I would like to ask you, in what ways you think the digital transformation can help advance the green transition and a more sustainable development model in LAC, excuse me, and the private sector. What's the role of the private sector? Over to you.
Thank you, Raga. Thank you very much for your introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I will switch in Spanish, if you don't mind, okay? ¿Cómo podemos desde el sector privado ayudar al proceso de transición verde? Bueno, yo tengo que decir que trabajando todos juntos. En este momento tenemos un panel muy representativo del sector público, con el señor ministro, del sector de la academia, de las organizaciones civiles, de la sociedad civil, pero lo que tenemos que hacer es trabajar todos juntos. Esto lo hemos notado justo durante la pandemia, que se ha acelerado un mayor trabajo y una colaboración público-privada cada vez más intensa. Notamos que es cada día más importante. Pero además de trabajar juntos, tenemos que pensar que hay dos transiciones que van a marcar la recuperación futura de nuestras economías y de nuestras sociedades. Uno es la transición verde y otra es la transición digital. Pero tenemos que saber que es precisamente la transición digital la que va a ayudar a la transición verde. ¿Por qué digo esto? Porque si nosotros trabajamos desde el sector de las telecomunicaciones en la transformación digital de las economías, va a ayudar enormemente a reducir las emisiones de carbono, va a ayudar enormemente a que la transición verde sea una realidad. En el caso del sector de las telecomunicaciones, tengo que decir que hay un fuerte compromiso desde hace varios años en el cual asumimos los operadores móviles en el desafío de trabajar para conseguir los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible de Naciones Unidas. Y lo tenemos en la carta, en el último informe que publicó la GSMA, que es la patronal del sector de las telecomunicaciones a nivel internacional, en su informe Mobile Net Zero, State of the Industry on Climate Action 2022, donde se pone de manifiesto el compromiso por parte de los operadores móviles de reducir el objetivo de 0 emisiones netas de aquí al año 2050. ¿Qué está haciendo Telefónica? Bien, nosotros solemos decir que la sostenibilidad está en el corazón de nuestras operaciones. Y venimos también trabajando en sostenibilidad desde hace algunos años. Y esto ha hecho que hayamos alcanzado un ranking de mucho prestigio en aquellas organizaciones que miden el grado de compromiso en sostenibilidad. Por ejemplo, en el año 2008, en España, nosotros apostamos para el desarrollo de fibra de nuestras redes, que son redes inteligentes. Y en esa apuesta por el desarrollo de fibra, tengo que decir que la fibra nos ha permitido una mayor eficiencia energética en un 80% en relación a lo que era el cobre. Pero también en el año 2019 ya implantamos nuestros primeros sitios 5G en el Reino Unido, que es un 90% más eficiente que el 4G. Pero, por ejemplo, también quiero continuar diciendo que toda nuestra red eléctrica es 100% renovable. Hemos digitalizado la mayoría de nuestros procesos productivos, de nuestros servicios digitales, más o menos el 80%. Y eso nos ha hecho lograr una mayor eficiencia energética, pero nos ha hecho también avanzar en la toma de decisiones, una mayor eficiencia en la toma de decisiones, con la utilización de servicios digitales, la utilización de la inteligencia artificial en Internet de las cosas. Y también ayudamos a nuestros clientes, ayudamos a toda nuestra cadena de valor. Y me gustaría también destacar algunos aspectos. ¿Cómo podemos ayudar a nuestros clientes? A reducir la huella de carbono. Ayudamos a nuestros clientes a tomar decisiones de manera predictiva con inteligencia artificial, por ejemplo, en los procesos productivos, en la aplicación de servicios digitales en las ciudades. Todo esto ha ido poco a poco que vayamos ganando en eficiencia energética y en eficiencia en general en todos los valores que tenemos que medir para la transición verde. Quiero destacar algunas cosas. Solamente en los últimos 6 años, solo los últimos 6 años, hemos conseguido que nuestros clientes reduzcan 8,7 toneladas de emisiones CO2, lo que equivale a haber plantado 158 millones de árboles. Creo que es un dato suficientemente revelador para poner de manifiesto el trabajo y el esfuerzo que estamos haciendo. Como me queda poco tiempo, me van a permitir que concluya con lo siguiente. ¿Qué tenemos que hacer en el futuro? 1, apostar por infraestructuras digitales inteligentes. Apostar significa que sean más eficientes y que desde el punto de vista energético. En segundo lugar, digitalizar los procesos productivos en la agricultura, en las fábricas, en las industrias, en todas las cadenas de valor. En tercer lugar, aplicar la innovación, Raga, ya que veo que estás muy también energética en esta dirección, aplicar la innovación de esos procesos productivos, porque a medida que más innovemos, más eficientes seremos y que mayor capacidad para mantener la transición verde. Y por último, también la educación, desarrollar las habilidades digitales necesarias para la utilización de esos servicios digitales. Por tanto, infraestructuras digitales, educación e innovación. Y Voy a terminar con unas palabras que le oí hace unos días a Sergio Granados, el presidente del Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina. Habló del GDP y dijo, el nuevo GDP significa el G de Green, el D de Digital y el P de People. Si somos capaces de concentrar nuestros esfuerzos en ese nuevo GDP, podremos hacer que nuestra sociedad avance mucho más rápidamente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. What a way to conclude this wonderful discussion. GDP. This is the way forward. And of course, to conclude, I would just like to ask all of you to give a round of applause to this fabulous panel. And I know that we could have been here all day. I have so many follow-up questions, but we will have to ask them and answer them in our next edition of the Latin American Outlook, because we will feed this discussion that we have had here today into that work, which is going to be, this year's edition is going to be on the green transition. So all of the things that we have heard here today is going to be built on, and I'm sure that we will continue our conversation. Next up is the second session, and that's how we finance the whole thing. Financing the transition, fiscal policies, public-private alliances, and international partnerships. And that's moderated by Jessica Bedoya, Chief of Staff and Chief Strategy Officer at the IDB. Jessica, where are you? And the floor is yours. I'm leaving, I swear. Thank you.
Bon après-midi, buenas tardes, good afternoon to everybody. I wanted to thank everyone for this opportunity to continue the conversation, to thank our previous panel for wonderful inputs on an important topic that we were all discussing here today. My name is Jessica Bedoya. I'm the Chief of Staff and Chief Strategy Officer at the Inter-American Development Bank. And I'm very happy to have arrived here on time, also with the president from Los Angeles, to be able to moderate what I think will be a very interesting panel. The topic today on financing the transition is really, really critical because it's a challenge that all of us are facing as multilaterals, and obviously governments, private sector, and regional development banks and local development banks are also confronting on a daily basis. We at the IDB, as the president had highlighted, are trying to be as ambitious as ever and also as proactive in working with private sector, with academia, civil society, with regional and local development banks to see how we can achieve the green transition in a just and equal way for everyone in Latin America and the Caribbean. So while we all acknowledge that a green transition is the best path toward development, growth, and social progress in Latin America, the question is, how will we finance it? As has been discussed by several speakers today, we're talking about a challenge that is in the trillions of dollars and multilateral development banks that are living in a world of billions of dollars. So we need to somehow shrink that gap. And the only way that we can do that is by working together and having these conversations. So today we have 4 things that we'd like to highlight to see as we have a conversation, a free-flowing conversation, I hope. 4 things that we should think about, which is how do we help workers transition to sectors that contribute to environmental sustainability or that are naturally low carbon? How do we ensure that workers and communities that are affected by the downsizing of fossil fuel find productive employment, reskilling, upskilling, and introduce them to new markets and sectors? How do we ensure that those jobs that are created offer decent working conditions, labor regulatory reforms that are really necessary across the region, but also more than that, wages that are fair and equitable across these sectors. And also giving all stakeholders a voice, which we think we saw really very well represented in the prior panel. And I think we'll continue that conversation in the representation in today's panel. So a couple of other ideas before we launch into the conversation from our perspective at the IDB. As we look at financing the transition, we have to design public investment policies accordingly at the government level to ensure that these investments prioritize sustainability initiatives that are labor intensive and environmental programs. And we have to be innovative. So I think common thread among all of these conversations and many others that I have had in Washington, DC and in the region is the word innovation. So I welcome that that was a main thread in the prior panel's conversation. Innovation is really leading the charge in all of this. It's where the markets are today in terms of the private sector. It's where the public sector has to remain at warp speed, moving toward ensuring innovative solutions to these problems. So as we talk about the space, as we talk about the stakeholders, I want to launch right into the conversation so I don't take up more oxygen. And I want to start first with the Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Colombia, Juan Manuel Restrepo Abondano. Thank you for being with us. And I wanted to just start with a first question and then feel free to comment on the question and any other issues as it relates to what you've seen firsthand in your experience in Colombia. Colombia, as we know, and we heard from your president through his video, has been a front runner in Latin America, the Caribbean, in advancing and implementing a green taxonomy to support green finance, and one of the first countries in the region to issue green bonds. So first is, what lessons have you learned in this experience from these efforts in terms of coordination within government and with the private sector? And also, what are the challenges that lie ahead? Minister.
Thank you, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the invitation, Sebastian, to all of you, to the ambassadors, minister, all the people who is in this panel. I think that before we were talking about which is the missing link. And I think that the missing link is funding for this green transition. And it's a more missing link now that we're facing difficulties on the fiscal side of our countries, in terms also of public debt. So let me begin by saying that COVID-19 has been not only the worst economic shock in our history, but it has also come with scars and wounds for our countries in terms of poverty, inequality, in terms of also unemployment, destruction of firms. So we have lost at least 8 years on what we have achieved in terms of social indexes. That's why, in my opinion, the first answer in a post-COVID era is to build social sustainability, especially for the most vulnerable. That means for SMEs, informal people, unemployed, youngsters, women, for example. And the first answer is to grow more and more. So to grow more, to create more employment, and to respond to that poverty and inequality. And one way to do it is moving faster on the green transition. That's my first point. Why is that? Because we, as Latin American countries, we have a huge opportunity in terms of our biodiversity. We can take advantage of that biodiversity as a source, as an engine of growth in the next future. But in addition to that, even though, as I said, the COVID-19 has implied social scars and wounds, it has also represented opportunities. And one of those opportunities is the growing concern about the common house, about the interest on the climate change. Based on that is when Colombia appeared in the discussion. During the pandemic, we actually moved faster on those goals. We actually said we are going to reduce by 2030, 51% of the greenhouse emissions in Colombia. We are going to be carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to be the first country in Latin America implementing a circular economy policy. We're going to do a revolution on clean energy. We're going to more than double the area, the land area and the ocean area protected in Colombia. And we're going to be by 2030, a country with 600,000 electric vehicles in our country. However, we know that all of this costs and costs a lot. What we're planning is that we have to get at least between $2 to $3 billion per year in the next 10 years from the private and from the public sector. How to do that? by designing what I call a full toolbox with 7 strategies. One of those strategies was to issue green bonds from the public sector. So we've issued for the first time in Latin America in the local market our green bonds, the second country in Latin America after Chile in the global market. And we started last semester with $400 million. We're going to do the next issuance this month by 29th of June of around another amount of $400 million. The other thing that we did is to develop the green taxonomy. We are now the 4th country in the world with a green taxonomy, which is a classification in which you identify which are the sectors and at the same time, which are the green objectives and how you connect both things to actually avoid what is called greenwashing. I think that that's another very important tool. We are developing also budget traces to actually have in detail and with accountability, what is actually the budget, the public budget on these green things. We are strengthening also the carbon market. We are implementing green taxes and incentives in this transition. We are promoting interinstitutional and international alliances like the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative. We are accessing to multilateral funds actually through new policies. We have just at least 5 new laws in Colombia, which have been funded by the World Bank, by IDB, by CAF, by BCI and other banks, more than $2.4 billion the last year. And I think that for the next future, what do we need? First of all, commitment from the academia, and we were discussing about that in the last panel, but also commitment from the private sector. We need to build the idea of these kind of B Corps, even in small and medium enterprises, which are the majority in our productive tissue in Latin America. To do that, actually, in Colombia, we developed a new law, a new decree on what we call Empresas B Corps, which in one of those objectives, they actually are part of the green transition. And also to see this environmental sustainability as a part, as I said before, of a comprehensive sustainability. Green sustainability, social sustainability, fiscal sustainability, and increasing growth also as a sustainable goal in our countries. So what, in my opinion, is the end of this story is how to move faster on one side. That's maybe a must for our countries. And I think that for ministers of finance, transforming the financial system to channel greater amount of capital towards green activities is not only a must, but a double must. But as I always say, in terms of finance, in terms of funding this green transition, we have to do more and more in the next years. And switching maybe to Spanish, that recalls me the idea from the master Miguel de Unamuno, who once said, quien no aspire a más, llegará a no ser nada. Tenemos que hacer mucho más, y mucho más, no solamente con esta batería de instrumentos, sino con muchos más instrumentos para financiar lo que debe ser un deber de humanidad, transitar en esta transición energética en el mundo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, ministro, por sus palabras y su entusiasmo y obviamente su liderazgo y dentro del gobierno colombiano. Let me transition quickly to Pierre Forestier. Thank you so much for being with us. You are the director of the Sustainable Development Department at Proparco, a partner for us at the Inter-American Development Bank. So thank you for participating in this conversation. And I think what the minister's comments really helped us understand is the important role of the private sector to fill the need given the constraints of the fiscal spaces that governments are facing as they are transitioning from triaging the COVID pandemic to a recovery and what a recovery plan looks like over the long term. So how is Proparco working to support financing in Latin America and the Caribbean on these issues? And how are you working with multilateral development banks such as the IDB as well, but others in terms of the financing, the structures and the projects that you're looking at?
Thank you very much. Please allow me to speak in French. So I switch in French. Your translation. Merci beaucoup. Merci pour cette invitation. Alors, comment on travaille en Amérique latine et de quelle manière? Alors, sur quoi et de quelle manière? D'abord, sur quoi? Alors, sur la question, je vais revenir très rapidement sur la question de la transition verte, de ces questions autour des questions climat. Il y a évidemment 3 gros sujets qui sont planétaires, mais qui sont aussi très forts pour l'Amérique latine, bien sûr. Celui d'atteindre net zéro, c'est-à-dire de réduire, de décarboner l'économie, c'est très clair. Il y a celui de la résilience, d'être confronté de toute façon à des changements climatiques et d'y faire face, d'aider l'économie et les populations à y faire face. Et puis le troisième aspect qui est celui de mais où on va après, c'est-à-dire quelle économie de demain, ça va être la transition vers quelque chose quelle nouvelle prospérité. Alors ces trois domaines. Le premier, c'est d'abord pour dire que sur la décarbonation, à ce stade, un peu partout dans le monde, hein, mais aussi en Amérique latine, on a plutôt démontré que c'était possible. On a des solutions énergétiques. Même les énergéticiens commencent à y croire d'ailleurs. On a des solutions pour les transports. On a des solutions. Mais on a des solutions pour le futur. On n'a pas encore traité totalement le problème au fond. On n'a pas traité les stocks. On ne sait pas tout ce qui émet encore ces millions de tonnes de CO2 dans l'atmosphère, elle continue d'émettre. Alors, on émet moins pour la croissance, les tonnes d'après, mais celles-là, elles existent. On n'a pas encore agi sur les comportements. En France, on voit, alors j'imagine que ce n'est pas exactement pareil partout, mais la diversité est évidemment importante entre les pays, mais en France, le transport représente 25% des consommations, des émissions de CO2. Ensuite vient l'alimentation et ensuite vient le logement. Évidemment, ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire que derrière, on peut faire baisser l'énergie, on peut être plus efficace, on peut changer l'énergie, mais il faut aussi changer les comportements, changer notre façon de faire. Et ça, on ne l'a pas encore fait. Donc, quelque part, les efforts de transition vont être majeurs dans le futur. Deuxième chose, la résilience. On est sur des choses, des questions qui sont aussi totalement nouvelles, importantes, majeures. On ne parle pas que de questions où se prémunir en termes d'assurance pour des récoltes, de problèmes de température importantes ou d'effets qui vont arriver au fur et à mesure de plus en plus forts. On parle aussi de quelque chose qui est beaucoup plus structurel, des choix qui vont être des choix d'installation d'infrastructures, de développement local, ou alors des choix d'investissement dans telle ou telle filière plus ou moins importante économiquement ou plus ou moins résiliente. Donc, on a des vrais choix locaux, nationaux, qui sont extrêmement puissants là-dessus. Et enfin, le troisième sujet, c'est celui évidemment de l'économie de demain. Alors, il y a un grand débat en France et partout, hein, c'est de savoir si on a les bons indicateurs économiques futurs pour cette économie. Est-ce que c'est toujours la croissance du PIB qu'il faudra regarder pour mesurer la prospérité? Et quoi qu'il en soit, cette prospérité nouvelle, elle va se marquer. Et elle va se marquer, comme le disaient d'ailleurs précédemment d'autres personnes ici, elle va se marquer vis-à-vis de ceux qui vont le plus rapidement possible prendre les avantages, l'expertise, les capacités. Alors, ça peut être dans l'emploi, l'économie, ça peut être dans l'expertise, ça peut être dans la façon de traiter, de s'organiser. En tout cas, ça va être un vrai challenge pour demain. Alors, du coup, ces trois grands challenges, il faut les traiter ensemble. Ça n'est pas qu'un seul challenge technologique, ça n'est pas qu'un challenge d'infrastructure. On est bien dans un challenge commun, très lourd. Alors, comment nous, on essaie de le traiter à une échelle où, évidemment, on est associé à un groupe plus large qui va traiter aussi les questions publiques, qui va essayer d'apporter du financement à l'échelle publique et nous, sur la partie privée, en accompagnement. Donc, on essaie d'avoir un continuum, mais on va traiter ça de quatre manières. En tout cas, notre stratégie est un peu fondée sur quatre principes. Le premier, c'est évidemment celui d'avoir un impact direct. Et d'impact direct, c'est avec les meilleurs standards. Essayons d'être alignés sur l'accord de Paris. On regarde que tous nos investissements vont avoir quelque part ou un bénéfice, ou en tout cas, ne vont pas bloquer la possibilité d'avoir une courbe pour les pays de réduire les émissions. On va regarder à ce que tous nos investissements ne seront pas remis en cause par le changement climatique dans quelques années. Donc ça, c'est des basiques, mais c'est absolument important. Évidemment, en apportant notre impact, on va aussi favoriser certains types de projets et il faut en tout cas, c'est très difficile de discuter en interne, mais il faut aussi ne plus faire un certain nombre de projets. C'est très, très compliqué à discuter, mais exclure un certain nombre de projets, c'est aussi donner une valeur à ce qui ne peut plus être fait, et donc une valeur à ce qui doit être fait. Deuxième chose, on essaie de travailler à la mobilisation. Mobilisation, ça veut dire faire venir d'autres investisseurs, faire venir le financeur. C'est un leitmotiv très, très important pour nous. C'est notre crédibilité. Il faut que quand on met un euro, on puisse faire venir beaucoup plus. Et là, il faut inventer. Évidemment, on a des instruments de marché, de garantie, de création d'instruments qui vont faire qu'on aide les investisseurs à prendre plus de risques, à venir de plus en plus sur ces sujets. Il y a aussi des instruments qui doivent être orientés avec quelque part des orientations aussi de nature d'activité à favoriser, mais on est vraiment sur quelque chose de majeur là-dessus, à la fois donc pour faire venir des investisseurs, donc de manière un peu transversale, mais aussi, comme je disais tout à l'heure, sur un continuum public-privé, parce qu'on n'y arrivera pas si on n'a pas un regard sur la politique publique, la capacité des acteurs à l'organiser, à la mettre en œuvre, la possibilité qu'elle draine et qu'elle fasse venir les privés, et puis derrière que les bénéficiaires finaux adoptent l'ensemble. Donc il faut regarder l'ensemble, sinon évidemment il n'y aura aucune transition, aucune trajectoire qui va le faire. Troisième sujet pour nous, c'est d'accompagner nos clients, d'accompagner la transition de nos clients. Comment nos clients qui offrent les services privés, qui offrent les services, les produits de demain, qui offrent les services et les produits d'aujourd'hui aussi, vont pouvoir quelque part aussi, non seulement dans leur comportement ou dans ce qu'ils font quand ils émettent des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, mais aussi dans ce qu'ils font indirectement par leurs produits et par leurs services. On va accompagner cette transition. Et ça veut dire avoir un regard et une discussion avec notre client sur le long terme pour lui permettre de faire cette trajectoire et d'être très bien positionné dans les marchés de futur. Enfin, quatrième sujet pour nous, c'est la création de marchés, la création de produits, la création de services. Imaginez ceux qui vont être les services de demain, aider évidemment les pays et les secteurs à imaginer ce que vont être ces services et ces économies de demain, et puis les financer, y compris avec des outils qui peut-être ne sont pas des outils classiques du secteur privé, un peu de subvention, un peu d'assistance technique, un peu d'accompagnement, je dirais, hors marché, mais qui vont permettre de booster quelque part la R&D, l'accompagnement en prise de risque, l'accompagnement et le suivi pour qu'il y ait de la crédibilité. Voilà, on a ces challenges-là. Alors évidemment, on travaille beaucoup avec les autres bailleurs de fonds sur ces sujets. Avec IDB, c'est très facile. On est un partenaire absolument aligné. On est très alignés ensemble. On cherche à travailler aussi avec les autres partenaires, peut-être ceux qui sont moins dans ces sphères internationales où on se parle, où on discute. Les banques de développement, c'est très important d'être avec elles. C'est elles qui vont aussi être les porteurs de ces changements localement. On en parlait, mon directeur général en parlait tout à l'heure. C'est très important. Et évidemment, pour nous, ce qu'on souhaite, c'est apporter une complémentarité, une valeur spécifique. On a, en venant, je dirais, de France, aussi la possibilité d'apporter peut-être des expertises, des complémentarités qui sont différentes et qui permettent d'avoir de l'innovation croisée, et aussi faire venir l'Europe, faire venir, je dirais, les fonds européens qui investissent, qui permettent aux investisseurs privés d'investir plus ou différemment, de les faire venir non seulement en Afrique, non seulement en Asie, mais aussi en Amérique latine, fortement sur des transitions, des trajectoires, et pas que l'énergie renouvelable, mais aussi l'énergie renouvelable. Voilà.
Merci. Merci for cette intervention. I think that from the IDB's perspective, we also are in agreement on a lot of those issues. And I think that we're starting to see the common threads of the conversation on the need to create these new markets of accompanying governments and providing technical assistance. And I thank you so much for the partnership with the IDB. We also are looking for other partners in the private sector and in the multilateral space, because part of our new initiative, obviously in terms of mobilizing private sector resources and combining that with the public sector knowledge that we have as an institution, is also making sure we're not reinventing the wheel, that we also are very complementary to the work that's being done in the region and across all of our member countries. And I think that that's part of the innovation as well, because I think in the multilateral space, frequently we work in our siloed environments and we don't look beyond our own institutional agendas, and we're changing that at the IDB. And that's why I'm really excited that we're having this conversation, and I'm excited by everything that you mentioned, in particular the risk factor, because I think that's a seamless transition to our next panelist, Jimena Blanco, who's the head of the Americas at Verisk Maple Crop. Thank you for being with us. And obviously understanding an uptick in ESG investments. And I know that through our many travels to New York and talking to investors, ESG is the name of the game right now. We would love to hear your views on how you're seeing the market, how you're seeing risk as we talk about ESG and working in areas that are increasingly complicated across the region.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. So, I mean, we're talking about, financing the transition. And I wanted to start with, what are we looking to finance? Because green projects are, it's a broad range of things we're talking about, right? We're talking about government-backed renewables, we're also talking about the private sector, and we're talking about private, low carbon policies. We're talking about replanting programs. We're talking about natural capital policies. But of course, what we've mentioned a lot of today is sovereign issuance, right? So we're talking about green bonds, sustainability linked bonds, and also social bonds. And I guess when we think about what makes up a green project, it's a bit challenging in the sense that we have to look to the future. What are we trying to achieve? And then work backwards, right? Is this project going to take us to the future we want to go to? And if the answer is no, then it's not a green project, right? If the answer is yes, then we can start thinking about how do we finance this project. But at the end of the day, I mean, we're talking about ESG that takes the first letter in the acronym, right? So we've got the E. And now, why are we financing that E? Because we can talk from a moral perspective to protect the environment. But at the end of the day, we're protecting the environment to protect our societies. And we're protecting our societies to build our economies and deliver prosperity in the long term. So when we're thinking about, the transition, we can't separate the E from the S. And, one thing I haven't heard today yet is social license. If I was sitting here right now talking about fossil fuels, the fossil fuel industry would be talking about social license to operate. And I think a key issue we need to think about the transition is that if something is green, doesn't automatically make it acceptable to a society. So we really need to think about the S in the ESG, right? And there's another reason for that, thinking about the G. When we don't take care of the S, we end up with G problems, with political risk, because the energy transition itself does carry ESG risks. And we've talked about them today in all the previous panels as well, right? So yes, we need to think about the SDGs. We need to think about impact need. I think one of the big challenges for asset managers is the fact that sometimes they use KPIs that are looking at issues that put governments and countries that really need the financing out of their remit. So they really need to balance this, impact need with how they look at the S and the G as well. And a key thing for us is that when we look at our ESG sovereign ratings tool, Latin America tends to do really well on the E. It does fairly well on the G, but the big problem is the S. So that's really, when we look at the country's ESG performance, we really need to focus on that. So if I think about the region and some of the challenges, of course, we have significant fossil fuel producers that will need to reskill their workforces and take them from low-skilled jobs to higher-skilled jobs. We have a challenge when it comes to the fiscal side, again, from transitioning from that fossil fuel exporting economy. And when you start looking at countries that subsidize fossil fuels, which are several in the region and are now struggling with inflation, with higher poverty. During the pandemic, we lost 12 years of poverty gains, with higher inequality. When we start looking at removing subsidies in fossil fuels, in the short term, it creates a major economic pain that actually increases the risk of civil unrest. And when we end up with civil unrest, we don't just end up with insurance losses, and we don't only end up with potential operational disruption for companies, we also end up with potential government instability and an inability to deliver public policies effectively. So this is really all linked together. We can't really separate one from the other. And I think Chile is a really good example of a country that's gone through the ESG journey and in its issuances, right? It's the only sovereign at this point that has done all of it, whether we're talking about green bonds, social bonds, sustainability linked bonds. But this really looks at the moment like something in the whole region and not just in Chile that's coming top down. And my question, and I think I don't have an answer, it's kind of a let's wait and see what happens next, is how does society feel about this? Is society accepting this? Or when we're looking at a country that has issued almost 25% of its current debt in this type of instruments, will there be an eventual backlash further down the line in the coming years and decades, like we've seen with more traditional financing? So I think if we're going to finance the transition, we need to do our homework right, and we need to do our homework right now.
Wonderful, thank you. And I am going to make a note because I do want to return, and I hope that we have a few minutes at the conclusion of this session. I'm going to break, I'm not going to conform to the agenda that was presented to me because it's more exciting and interesting to kind of be extemporaneous sometimes during these conversations. But I think the social issue is so critical and so important. And I want to return to it with one final question, the same question for all of the panelists to see what their insights are. I think it'll be very informative. But let's transition to Javier, a good friend and colleague with whom I've worked for a long time in the development sphere. So I'm happy that you're here today to share your views on the role of national development banks and what role they can play in terms of leveraging the financing, mobilizing resources, and addressing all of the challenges and issues we're looking at with a green transition.
Thank you, Jessica. Voy a pasar a español porque creo que tenemos traducción simultánea. Bueno, ante todo, un agradecimiento muy grande a la OECD por esta invitación. Un saludo a los copanelistas, señor ministro de Hacienda que nos acompaña en este momento. Como decía Jessica, yo quiero aprovechar el tiempo que tengo para hablar de cómo los bancos nacionales de desarrollo aportamos a este cambio climático, a mitigar el cambio climático y cómo proveemos un puente en la financiación. Y creo yo, somos uno de los puntos donde se encuentran la política pública y el sector privado. Así que, si me lo permiten, voy a compartir algunos ejemplos concretos en esta medida. Primero, pues la pregunta obvia es ¿por qué los bancos de desarrollo nacionales? ¿Cuál es la relevancia? Y la teoría nos solía decir que donde había una falla de mercado que el sector privado no podía cubrir, entonces por ahí entrábamos los bancos públicos. Y probablemente esa racionalidad tuvo su lógica, pero hoy día es mucho más. Y creo que en eso los bancos multilaterales y los bancos de desarrollo, y también agradezco que esté aquí Proparco, los bancos públicos de desarrollo hacemos mucho más que eso. Y creo que la palabra clave entre la banca pública y la banca privada es colaboración. Si hubiera alguna duda de esta lógica, creo que quedó demostrado que sí funciona desafortunadamente con ocasión de la pandemia, pero afortunadamente con ocasión de la pandemia. Y voy a mi primer ejemplo. En Colombia, el cierre, el lockdown de la sociedad con ocasión del COVID-19 se dio el 17 de marzo. Ahí se declaró la emergencia económica. El 18 de marzo en Bancoldex sacamos la primera línea de crédito subsidiada a nivel nacional, porque veníamos trabajándolo con el Ministerio de Comercio, veníamos ya preparándonos para una disrupción en las cadenas productivas a nivel mundial. 2 años después, tenemos 70 líneas de crédito subsidiadas que llegan a todo el territorio nacional y en colaboración con los bancos privados movilizamos más de $1.000 millones en líneas de crédito con mayores plazos, periodos de gracia y tasas reducidas. Entonces, ese es un primer ejemplo de cómo banca pública y banca privada nos encontramos en el camino para un bien común. Otro ejemplo, si me lo permiten, es la emisión de bonos. Aquí hemos hablado de la emisión de bonos soberanos. Pues los bancos subnacionales o los bancos públicos de desarrollo, en este caso Bancoldex, hemos sido pioneros en la emisión de bonos verdes y bonos sociales. Emitimos bonos sociales hace un mes, habíamos emitido bonos sociales la primera vez en el año 2018 y para nosotros el bono social significa colocación de cartera microcrediticia. Puede significar muchas otras cosas, pero para nosotros lo importante es que lo que captamos en el mercado de capitales lo llevamos hacia un mejor microcrédito. Y ese es otro ejemplo al que me quiero referir. Durante este tiempo, 2 años, tal vez inclusive 3 años, hemos desarrollado un grupo de innovación en Bancoldex. Es un grupo dedicado exclusivamente a pensar en proyectos innovadores y cómo llevarle mejores soluciones a la gente que más lo necesita en nuestro país. En este tiempo hemos desarrollado por lo menos 3 productos, pero me quiero referir a uno. Es una plataforma que se llama Neocrédito. Y los invito a todos, por favor, a que la consulten, Neocrédito, en la página web de Bancoldex. Neocrédito es un marketplace, el anglicismo lo que significa es que cualquier microempresario colombiano se puede registrar, puede hacer visible su negocio y tenemos aliados financieros en la misma página que entran a competir por el crédito del microempresario. Entonces, a los microempresarios les damos visibilidad, les damos acceso a aliados financieros que de otra manera no tendrían y ponemos a los aliados financieros a competir por el crédito microempresarial. Solamente llevamos 2 meses al aire con este producto innovador, pero en 2 meses tenemos más de 1.000 microempresarios registrados, ya tenemos más de 100 solicitudes de crédito en curso, tenemos 11 desembolsos efectivos y esos 11 desembolsos equivalen casi a $250,000. Son números incipientes, pero lo que ya estamos viendo es que los aliados financieros están dispuestos y felices de competir por tener acceso a los microempresarios. Entonces, imaginémonos esta plataforma no en miles, sino en cientos de miles y en millones de microempresarios que necesitan mejor crédito. Entonces, ese es otro punto al que me quería referir en términos de lo que hacemos y debemos estar haciendo los bancos
Claudia,
de
if you can
desarrollo.
hear me, can you come
Veo que
to
mi tiempo
your
está
camera,
casi por
please?
concluir,
We have
pero
to
para
check
que
your video, please. Thank you very much.
de fallas de mercado es mucho más que simplemente crédito subsidiado, porque hay otras formas de ser relevantes y tiene que ver todo con la innovación. Y por eso agradezco que en el panel pasado Trinidad haya hablado de estas soluciones y también agradezco que hagamos énfasis en la S, porque lo social es donde países como Colombia necesitan mucho más apoyo y lo social tiene que ver todo con innovación. Si sacamos productos innovadores, la gente está más que dispuesta a consumirlos. Así que con ese respeto por el tiempo, agradezco la pregunta.
Javier, gracias por las palabras. Very well. We have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to take this opportunity because
Claudia, please, can you activate your camera and check, need to check your video, please. Thank you very much. Voilà. Perfect.
problem solving as we look to a green transition.
Thank you very much.
Which is this concept of the S, of the social
Claudia,
and winners
okay.
and losers. Does the green transition really have to mean winners and losers across Latin America and the Caribbean? And I want to hear a little bit of your perspectives on that. And I know we're short on time, so maybe 2 minutes each of you to give us your perspective on whether a green transition has to mean winners and losers. You know, we at the IDB frequently have this debate that development shouldn't be zero sum. If done well, institutionally and sustainably, it isn't a zero-sum game. But yet people still think that it is to some degree in this paradigm of climate change and green. So I want to hear from each of you. Let me start with the minister first on how do you see the issue of winners and losers as it ties into the social dynamics that we're confronting today in Latin America and the Caribbean? Ministro.
Thank you. And I think, yes, there are maybe in the short term costs and losers. In the long term, no, there are winners. That's why this is a moment in which those kind of dilemmas appear in the middle, and we have to deal with that. It's the only way, especially when building public policy. Just one example. Recently, we needed to create a new fiscal reform in Colombia. We needed it. And we started to discuss about these ideas of green taxes, which at the end, there are winners. But the discussion has to be done with the society. That's why we implemented a consensus. We built a consensus. I was saying that Chile is doing the same thing. And based on that consensus, the majority of the people say, yes, we think that we have to do that, but this is not the moment. This is not the context to do it. So don't do it. Otherwise, you will have a social unrest. So we didn't do it. That doesn't mean that at the end we have to do it, but we have to be very careful about building this context and consensus in this moment. That's why I think that Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF, she has said something which is quite relevant. This is a moment in which we have to redevelop the post-Breton institutions in the world. This is a moment in which we have to build the social sustainability plus the green sustainability. And I add, firm sustainability at the same time and fiscal sustainability at the same time. That's what I always talk about, comprehensive sustainability. It's the only way in which, in my opinion, is going to be possible to build new public policies in the next future. Public policies in the next future are not just a top-down approach, but a bottom-up and a top-down approach at the same time.
Thank you, Minister. Pierre.
Yes. It's really a tricky issue. We have in France and every country a track record of transition, which are not easy. We all know that. But this, what we have to do there, it's not only a transition. It's not only a transition to something that at the end will be the same. When I speak about behavior, when I speak about what we have to change, it's not only technology, new technology that will bring something that at the end, well, okay, we'll live better, but we'll live the same. No, probably, and at least my opinion, is that it will not be enough. The transition we have is much more impactful than that. And then it will need to have also a change of behavior in terms of the way we are consuming, the way we are dealing, the way we are organized, the way we are organizing our activities. Well, and it will be a big change. So we need not only, I would say, to speak about technology, but we have to speak about new way, new organization, new philosophy. And you are right. It's probably also a new way to build new policies. Not only to build your policies, but the way you are doing that with people, because obviously you don't have any track record for this magnitude of change we need. So you need to have a sort of, I would say, support in principle, or step-by-step support, because we are going there, but we don't know exactly how to do. It's going to be an enormous challenge.
Thank you. Jimena.
Well, I think, of course, I work in the risk industry, so there are lots of risks. But what I didn't speak about are the mitigations and opportunities, right? So I think, first of all, we can learn from the experiences that have already been there, right? So when we talk about renewable projects facing social backlash, and we can see it from hydro to solar to wind, from Mexico to Argentina, projects being suspended or canceled because of social opposition, I think there's been opportunities missed there of learning about how do you consult communities, how do you bring stakeholders to the table from other industries that are the ones we're trying to transition away from, that have been doing it for decades. And in things about, land acquisition, talking to civil society, governments, multilaterals, and the private sector, right? They're all part of the solution. So yes, we're talking about risks, but there are lots of long-term opportunities, like the minister said. One of them, for example, if we think about gender, when we talk about the transition and the end game, renewables employ 32% women versus fossil fuel, which only employs 22% women. So right there, that transition is helping us on achieving some SDG goals. And then also when we're talking about economic development, the cost of electricity, for example, is a lot more stable in a renewable matrix than it is in a fossil matrix, where we're dependent on oil and gas price volatility. So, I don't think it needs to be a zero-sum game. I think we need to apply a variety of tools and not just think about the environmental impact, but be a lot broader about how we do a risk matrices and what things we're thinking about. And sometimes it's about connecting the dots, right? It's not about siloing the E, the S, and the G, but actually thinking they all go hand in hand.
Absolutely, 100% in agreement with you. Javier, please.
A ver, yo creo que para tomar la pandemia hacia atrás, en una línea de tiempo, ha habido en Latinoamérica demasiadas poblaciones que han perdido durante solo tiempo y solo han perdido. Entonces creo que de la pandemia hacia adelante solo deberíamos pensar en ganadores y que la gente gane de manera sostenible y de manera equitativa. Y también el tema de género, gracias por traerlo de nuevo, quiero comentarlo también desde una perspectiva muy práctica. En Bancoldex, en los últimos 2 años, hemos diseñado líneas de microcrédito exclusivamente para mujeres, y ponemos las líneas allá afuera y se van en segundos. Entonces, creo que la necesidad es tan grande y la tecnología nos permite hacer cosas hoy que no se podían hacer ni hace 2 ni hace 5 años, que realmente debemos estar pensando en soluciones para que las poblaciones que más han sido vulneradas sean las que ganen hacia adelante. Creo que no es un juego de suma cero, todos deberíamos estar en posibilidad de ganar, pero es que hay una deuda histórica muy grande. Hay una deuda de género, hay una deuda con poblaciones en pobreza, y tristemente vimos que cuando llegan las pandemias o las guerras, las poblaciones que más sufren son las vulnerables, y los objetivos de desarrollo que más se afectan son los de reducción de pobreza, los de combate a la desigualdad y de crecimiento equitativo. Entonces, con base por lo menos en esos 3 objetivos de desarrollo, tendríamos que estar diseñando soluciones para todo el mundo.
De acuerdo, 100%. I completely agree with you. And I do think the mention of women, I think that's something that we're also as an institution trying to look to see how we can better integrate that issue and make it not just a box checking exercise, but an issue of really training and skilling of women to bring them into the formal workforce. And I think there's a great opportunity to do that now in a green transition, especially. So I agree with you 100%. I think we're about to close the session, and I think we've done a really great job of laying out the challenges and the opportunities. I want to thank all of the 4 panelists. I think on a conclusion and a note to conclude on the takeaways that I have from this conversation is that we need incentives, innovation, and speed to facilitate a green transition that is to the benefit for all of us and here in the room and for the Latin America and the Caribbean and all of the millions of people that have suffered during the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you all to the panelists for your contributions today. Thank you to the audience for participating and listening. And thank you again for being with us today.
Good afternoon. Bonsoir. Buenas tardes. Federico Banaglia, soy el director adjunto del Centro de Desarrollo de la OCDE y es un placer introducir el cierre de este foro, de esta, this is 14th edition of the International Economic Forum on Latin America and the Caribbean. My role is very limited. I will just need to introduce our 2 distinguished speakers for the closing and then invite you to join us for a social event upstairs. So I will really follow what Jessica just said in terms of incentive, innovation, and speed. I will be fast. I will be innovative because our 2 speakers are connecting by video, and I will provide you an incentive to stay because we have a cocktail following this closing. So with no further ado, let me introduce Claudia Gintersdorfer, who is the head of a division for regional affairs at the European External Affairs Service. And then we will have the pleasure of having Ambassador Manuel Escudero, who is the permanent representative of Spain to the OECD and chair of the governing board of the OECD Development Center. So with no further ado, Claudia, you have the floor, please.
Many thanks for this. First of all, thank you for inviting us to this closing. And I wish I or someone from my institutions could be there in person for you, because it seems to have been a really interesting event. But I would like to give a special thanks to the co-organizing organizations of the forum. So the OECD Development Center, the IDB and IFD, as well as to all the high-level representatives of the countries from Latin America and Caribbean, as well as their delegations. And of course, all those present at OECD headquarters and connected online. The forum is an important and well-established milestone for exchanging and dialoguing with LAC countries and with experts on this region. And the European Union believes that we have to take advantage of the opportunities discussed in the forum, as the region has an enormous potential to develop hand in hand with its main partners, this much needed sustainable and inclusive economic growth, coupled with the green transformation. And the theme chosen for the forum could not be more timely nor more relevant. The EU has really placed the green transition at the very heart of its recovery strategy. And it's also an essential pillar of its sustainable development model. So considering that Latin America and Caribbean is the region with the world's greatest biodiversity and also abundant natural resources, as has been discussed today, there is considerable potential for the green transition to be a driver of greater productivity, but also of inclusion and of well-being. So the EU stands ready to support the region in advancing green strategies, and international partnerships can support to drive this green transition in the region. And of course, they can also be part of the global answer to what is a global challenge. So we are making particular efforts domestically to achieve a just and truly transformative green transition, namely through the ambitious Green Deal agenda that you've all heard about. But in consultation also with our partner countries from Latin America and Caribbean, we have identified the green transition as one of the key areas for the EU partnership for the 7 years to come, where we have a new financial instrument, the so-called Global Europe 2021 to 2027. And it will also be central to a new EU initiative that is the Global Gateway. So to advance, all partners need to redirect sufficient funding to ensure that the deployment of the green transition becomes a reality. Better and greener investments and new financial instruments are needed. This is less a question of more and additional funds. It's more an issue of redirecting investments into a more sustainable direction. And as has been mentioned by previous speakers, it's really about, imagining the future that we want and then checking if the investments that we make bring us closer to that future or not. So the billions and trillions that would be invested into the old style fossil fuel economy should instead go into the new green economy. This will also save considerable externality costs and climate impacts. Climate adaptation and mitigation must both be part of this equation. Second, international partnerships can provide technical support for the implementation of national, but also of regional strategies for Latin America and Caribbean. For instance, they can foster innovation and attract greener investments. They can contribute to sharing experience in creating green jobs. And new sustainable trade opportunities can also foster regional integration and sustainable global supply chains. So the EU is developing so-called Team Europe initiatives and flagships, both at bilateral and at regional level, to advance the green transition and to support compliance with international commitments in this area. So we are eager to continue our high-level political and technical contacts. Finally, I understand that all the discussions here will be included in the next edition of the Latin America Economic Outlook, the LEO, which is our joint flagship publication with the OECD for Latin America and the Caribbean, and which is co-authored too with the UN LAC and the CAF. So we're looking forward to deepening this debate through the environmental agenda included in the EU facility for LAC on development and transition. We also look forward to continue to strengthen our cooperation with all the participants and to continue working for the well-being of citizens and of future generations. So thank you once more to the organizers of this LAC Forum at the OECD Development Center, the IDB, and the AFD for this event. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Claudia, for your very kind words and for reaffirming the strong commitment of the European Union towards the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, and mentioning the strong partnership that we have built in the framework of the Facility on Development in Transition. And we also look forward to continuing working with you and advancing toward this important agenda, realizing this important agenda. Let me now give the floor to Ambassador Manuel Escudero, who, as I said, is the permanent representative of Spain to the OECD and also the chairman of the governing board of the Development Center. Manu, la palabra a ti, por favor.
Oh, thank you, Federico. I will speak in Spanish, being Spaniard. So, panelistas, estimados colegas, como presidente del Comité Directivo del Centro de Desarrollo de la OCDE, realmente es un honor dar las palabras de clausura junto con nuestros colegas de las instituciones coorganizadoras del foro, el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo y la Agencia Francesa de Desarrollo, así como con representantes de los países de la región y panelistas de realmente tan alta calidad. Es para mí un honor estar por dos motivos principales. En primer lugar, porque el foro se sigue reafirmando como el evento de referencia sobre América Latina y el Caribe en Europa. Durante casi una década y media, el foro reúne a representantes del sector público, privado, académico y de la sociedad civil de ambas regiones para dialogar sobre desafíos comunes e identificar agendas y estrategias de acción compartidas. Y en segundo lugar, porque me da la oportunidad de destacar la pertinencia de la temática que nos invita a reflexionar el foro hoy. La transición verde es un esfuerzo inaplazable que nos convoca a todos, más aún en el contexto actual de recuperación post-COVID. La discusión de hoy ha sido, yo creo, buen reflejo de este objetivo. con diversos actores aportando sus perspectivas sobre cómo podemos asegurar que esta transición verde sea además una transición justa. Y en este sentido me gustaría compartir algunas reflexiones que me parecen esenciales para lograr una transición verde que sea verdaderamente transformadora. En primer lugar, la necesidad de diseñar las políticas de recuperación con un enfoque muy apegado a la realidad económica, social y política de la región. Creo que esta es la base para abordar la transición verde. ¿Qué hemos visto en la pandemia en muchos países latinoamericanos? Tenemos que decir sistemas débiles de sanidad, que no podían ser instrumentos útiles en la lucha contra el COVID. Y sistemas débiles de protección social, que no alcanzaban a ayudar a todas las familias y las pequeñas empresas a superar económicamente el confinamiento. El resultado ha sido unos elevados índices de mortalidad y un retroceso en términos de pobreza. Y la causa ha sido unos sistemas de protección social que no cubren universalmente a los ciudadanos, que colocan al borde de la pobreza a millones y que muestran la realidad de unas clases medias débiles y pequeñas, estancadas y algunas veces en retroceso. Pero esa situación que se ha revelado muy claramente con la pandemia no cae del cielo. Existe porque, sobre todo, no hay suficientes recursos públicos para que existan sistemas de protección que puedan cubrir a toda la población. Si no se dota de mecanismos de reforma fiscal que aumenten el volumen de los recursos públicos y aumenten la progresividad fiscal, Latinoamérica no avanzará. Este es el contrato social, el nuevo contrato social que planteó el LEO 2021. Y junto a él, la necesidad de diversificación productiva, con un nuevo papel del Estado que no es ya ni la titularidad pública a toda gran empresa, ni las privatizaciones y desregulaciones como única solución, sino, como antes se decía, un nuevo papel de lo público como iniciador, catalizador y creador de marcos donde las empresas puedan florecer. Sobre esta base, desde este nuevo contrato social, que no ocurre en un espacio temporal, sino que se da realmente en medio de una realidad que es ya imparable, que es la transición verde y la transición digital. No podía, por ejemplo, realizarse la primera revolución industrial sin la introducción y generalización del uso de las máquinas. Pues hoy, en nuestros días, no se puede progresar si no es sobre dos nuevas bases transversales que afectan a todas las actividades económicas: la transición verde y la transición digital. Por eso, el nuevo contrato social es verde y es digital. Bueno, por supuesto, esta afirmación no es simple, es compleja, porque la transición ecológica y el nuevo contrato social deberán ir de la mano, o si no es así, no habrá transición con todo lo que significa esto hacia el futuro. Por todo ello, yo creo que tenemos enfrente de nosotros un reto. Es un reto en el que hay que hacer un largo recorrido de diseño de políticas de descarbonización, de movilidad, de diseño urbano, de modelo energético, de fiscalidad, de agua, de océanos, de biodiversidad. Y previo a todo ello, quizás debería existir un marco estratégico nacional muy transversal para hacer posible esta transición. Y es por ahí, creo yo, en mi humilde opinión, por donde una publicación de tanto prestigio como el LEO debería avanzar durante este año y hacia su publicación en 2022. Y finalmente, permítame una nota también de optimismo, una nota de mirada hacia el futuro como América Latina. Porque la transición verde es también una oportunidad estratégica que podría permitir a la región alcanzar una narrativa consensuada y un mejor posicionamiento a nivel global, unificando los objetivos sobre lo que significa la transición verde para América Latina y el Caribe, identificando juntos cuáles son las necesidades y oportunidades específicas de avanzar en la transición verde y las políticas que mejor encajan en el actual contexto socioeconómico latinoamericano. La región, creo yo, puede recobrar su espacio en la arena internacional. Como se anotó desde el inicio de este foro, la región abarca la mitad de la biodiversidad mundial, cerca de un tercio del agua potable y un cuarto de los bosques. Tiene las dotaciones principales para ser un gran actor de la agenda verde internacional. En este sentido, una más fuerte integración regional y nuevas alianzas internacionales, incluidas con la Unión Europea, el Centro de Desarrollo de la OCDE y la OCDE, yo creo que son claves para avanzar en esta dirección. Para concluir, quiero resaltar que todos estos debates serán incluidos en la próxima edición del Informe Perspectivas Económicas de América Latina 2022, el LEO por sus siglas en inglés. Una publicación bandera de la OCDE sobre la región de América Latina y el Caribe. Motivo por el cual quiero reiterar la importancia de seguir fortaleciendo la cooperación con todos ustedes aquí presentes para seguir trabajando en pos del bienestar de los latinoamericanos. Estoy seguro que el foro seguirá ofreciendo perspectivas innovadoras para los desafíos que nuestra querida región enfrenta. Adelante, Latinoamérica.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Many thanks, Ambassador, for your words. And as I promised you, I wanted to be fast, innovative, and to provide you incentives. So I will not add much, just a few words of thanks, because I think that you had excellent discussions today, and this was thanks to the extraordinary panelists that we have. But it was also thanks to all the teams that are working behind the scenes. It was thanks to the excellent interpretation. Let me thank the interpreter. Thank you very much. It was thanks to the team that I have here in front of me. I will not name one by one. They know who they are. And it was thanks to the excellent partnership that we have with the Inter-American Development Bank and with the Agence Française de Développement. Let me recall that this forum is taking place in the framework of the Ministerial Council meeting of the OECD, but also of the Semaine de l'Amérique latine in France. And as we heard at the beginning from Rémi Rioux, France, and as we heard from Claudia at the end in Brussels, France and Europe care about Latin America and the Caribbean. The OECD cares about Latin America and the Caribbean, and you can count on us at the Development Center to make sure that this agenda will stay at the center of our thinking, of our reflections, but also of our action. With this, I would like to invite you to join us for our social event that is going to take place upstairs in the Salon du Parc. You just take the elevator and turn right, and you're all welcome to join us for a drink or a fizzy glass of water. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Au revoir.
Thank you.